The police came to my door 3 times before I finally let them in. Not because I was being difficult, but because I genuinely didn't know what to tell them that wouldn't sound completely insane. How do you explain to 2 officers from West Midlands Police that you've witnessed a murder, that you know exactly who did it and roughly where it happened, but you can't tell them how you know, because the explanation involves admitting you were somewhere online you absolutely shouldn't have been? I'm sitting in what they call protective custody now, a safe house in Wolverhampton that smells of cigarettes and cheap air freshener. And I still don't know if I did the right thing by coming forward. My name's Helen. I'm 53 years old, and until 6 weeks ago, I was living a completely ordinary life in Birmingham, working as a medical secretary. Then I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and now everything's different. It started with insomnia, which probably sounds like a boring way to begin a story about witnessing a murder, but that's genuinely how it happened. I'd been having trouble sleeping for months after my divorce was finalized. Nothing dramatic. David and I had just grown apart after 26 years of marriage. No affairs, no big arguments, just a slow realization that we'd become strangers who happened to share a house. The divorce itself was remarkably civil, but afterwards I found myself lying awake at 2 and 3 in the morning, my mind racing through decades of memories and wondering where it had all gone wrong. I'd scroll through my phone for hours. News articles, social media, online shopping I never actually completed. Anything to distract myself from the silence of the empty house. That's when I started noticing the adverts for insomnia remedies and sleep aids that seemed to follow me around every website. The algorithms had clearly identified me as someone struggling with sleep, and they were determined to sell me solutions. One advert caught my attention because it wasn't selling anything. It was just a link to an article about alternative approaches to insomnia, things beyond the usual advice about sleep hygiene and avoiding screens before bed. The article itself was fairly standard: meditation techniques, dietary changes, that sort of thing. But at the bottom was a link to what it described as a community for people with severe sleep problems, a support group that operated through private channels to protect members' privacy. I'd scroll through my phone for hours, news articles, social media, online shopping I never actually completed. Anything to distract myself from the silence of the empty house. That's when I started noticing the adverts for insomnia remedies and sleep aids that seemed to follow me around every website. The algorithms had clearly identified me as someone struggling with sleep, and they were determined to sell me solutions. One advert caught my attention because it wasn't selling anything. It was just a link to an article about alternative approaches to insomnia, things beyond the usual advice about sleep hygiene and avoiding screens before bed. The article itself was fairly standard: meditation techniques, dietary changes, that sort of thing. But at the bottom was a link to what it described as a community for people with severe sleep problems, a support group that operated through private channels to protect members' privacy. I should have been immediately suspicious of anything that emphasized privacy and private channels that much. But I was desperate and lonely, and 2 o'clock in the morning makes terrible decisions seem reasonable. I clicked the link and found myself on a website that looked like it had been designed in about 1998. Basic text, minimal formatting, just a simple registration form for joining their community. The registration process was more complex than I'd expected. It required downloading specific software that would let me access their private discussion spaces. Something about protecting members' anonymity and ensuring a safe space for people to discuss their struggles without judgment. The software took nearly an hour to set up properly, and I almost gave up several times when it seemed too complicated for what should have been a simple support group. But eventually I got it working and found myself looking at what appeared to be a fairly standard online community. Discussion boards about different types of sleep problems, threads where people shared what had worked for them, even a section for just general chat among insomniacs who were awake at odd hours. I spent a few nights just reading through discussions, occasionally posting my own experiences and getting sympathetic responses from other members. It was comforting in a way, realizing I wasn't alone in lying awake at 3 a.m, feeling like the only person in the world who couldn't sleep. But I started noticing that some sections of the community were restricted, requiring additional permissions to access. When I asked about this in one of the public discussion areas, someone explained that the restricted sections were for members who'd been active in the community for a while and had established trust with other participants. It was apparently meant to create more intimate discussion spaces for people dealing with particularly difficult situations. That explanation seemed reasonable enough. Online communities often have different tiers of access based on participation and trust. I continued posting in the public areas, and after about 2 weeks received a notification that I'd been granted access to some of the restricted sections. The restricted discussions were more personal and raw than what I'd seen in the public areas. People talking about the real reasons they couldn't sleep, trauma, grief, guilt about things they'd done or failed to do. It felt like being trusted with genuine human vulnerability, and I found myself sharing more honestly about the sadness and loss I was feeling after my divorce. But there was another category of restricted sections that I still couldn't access. Discussions that required what the system called verified membership. I didn't think much about it initially. Presumably, those were for people who'd been active in the community even longer than I had. It was about 3 weeks into my participation when someone sent me a private message offering to sponsor me for verified membership. They explained that verified sections dealt with particularly sensitive topics that required absolute discretion, and that sponsorship from an existing verified member was how they controlled access to ensure the community remained safe. The person seemed genuine in their messages, and they'd been helpful to me in several public discussions about managing anxiety-related insomnia. They explained that verified sections included discussions about topics that mainstream platforms wouldn't allow, controversial treatment approaches, substances that helped with sleep but weren't technically legal, that sort of thing. I was uncomfortable with the implications, but also curious about what kind of discussions required such elaborate security. The message emphasized that verification was completely optional, that I was welcome to continue participating in the non-verified sections, but that some members found the verified discussions particularly helpful for their most difficult struggles. I accepted the sponsorship partly out of curiosity, and partly because by that point I'd been awake since midnight, and my judgment was impaired by exhaustion. The verification process required confirming my identity through several steps that seemed excessive for an insomnia support group, but I completed them anyway. When I finally gained access to the verified sections, I immediately realized this wasn't about insomnia treatment at all. The discussions were about accessing illegal content, trading various prohibited materials, even coordinating activities that were obviously criminal in nature. I'd somehow ended up in what I later learned was a dark web community that used the insomnia support group as a front for recruiting people into their actual operations. I should have immediately closed the software and deleted everything, should have reported what I'd found to authorities and moved on with my life. But I was frozen by a combination of shock and morbid fascination. I'd stumbled into a part of the internet I'd only heard about in news reports, and some awful part of me wanted to understand what I was actually looking at. The discussions were coded and cryptic, using language that clearly meant something other than what the words literally said. People weren't directly stating criminal intentions. Everything was framed in theoretical or hypothetical terms, but the context made it obvious what they were actually discussing. I found myself scrolling through these discussions over several nights, trying to understand the scope of what I'd accidentally accessed. There were sections for different types of illegal activities, all disguised behind innocuous-sounding category names that wouldn't mean anything to casual observers. That's when I found the section that changed everything. It was labeled something bland like social meetups, but when I clicked through, I found discussions about coordinating what were clearly violent crimes against specific individuals. People were sharing detailed information about targets, their routines, their vulnerabilities, even photographs and addresses. One thread in particular made me feel physically sick. It was discussing someone named Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 30s who apparently lived somewhere in the West Midlands. The thread included dozens of photographs of her going about her daily life, shopping, walking to work, sitting in cafes. Someone had been systematically documenting her movements over what looked like several weeks. The discussion around these photographs was careful and coded, but the intent was clear enough that I couldn't pretend I didn't understand what I was reading. People were planning to harm this woman, discussing the best approaches and timing, even coordinating who would do what. What made it worse was seeing the casual tone of these discussions. People were planning violence with the same matter-of-fact language you'd use to organize a dinner party. There were even jokes and casual banter between the participants, as if coordinating serious harm against a stranger was just another form of social interaction. I spent the rest of that night trying to work out what to do with what I'd discovered. I couldn't report it to the police without admitting I'd accessed these illegal websites, which would presumably make me complicit in whatever was being planned. But I couldn't just ignore it knowing that a real person was being systematically stalked and threatened. I tried researching Sarah Chen through normal internet searches, hoping to find her social media or some other way to warn her. But the name was common enough that I couldn't identify which of the various Sarah Chens in the West Midlands was the one being targeted. And even if I could find her, what would I say? That I'd been browsing illegal websites and saw her being discussed. I stopped accessing the community entirely after that night, deleted the software from my computer, and tried to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood what I was reading. Maybe the discussions were just disturbing fantasies that would never translate into actual harm. Maybe I was being paranoid and overreacting to something that was just tasteless internet conversation. But I couldn't stop thinking about those photographs of Sarah Chen going about her ordinary life, completely unaware that strangers were documenting her movements and discussing how to harm her. Every time I tried to sleep, I'd see those images. Imagine her not knowing she was being watched and targeted. It was about 2 weeks later when I saw the news report. A woman's body had been found in a wooded area near Sutton Coldfield. She'd been missing for several days before hikers discovered her. The news initially didn't release her name pending family notification, but something about the location and timing made my stomach drop. When they finally identified her as Sarah Chen, 32, from Birmingham, I knew immediately that I'd watched people planning her murder and done nothing to stop it. I'd seen the discussions, seen the photographs, understood enough of what was being coordinated to know she was in danger. And I'd convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to get involved. I spent 3 days in a kind of paralyzed horror, unable to eat or sleep properly, replaying everything I'd read and wondering if reporting it earlier could have saved her life. The police were appealing for information, asking anyone who'd seen anything suspicious to come forward. But how could I explain what I knew without admitting I'd accessed those websites? That's when the police came to my door the first time. They were conducting house-to-house inquiries in the area where Sarah Chen had worked, which was near the medical practice where I was employed. They asked standard questions about whether I'd seen anything unusual, whether I knew the victim, that sort of thing. I told them no, I didn't know her and hadn't seen anything relevant. They thanked me for my time and left, and I felt like the worst kind of coward for not telling them what I actually knew. They came back the second time because they were expanding their inquiries and wanted to know if I'd remembered anything additional. Again, I said no, and again, they left. This time, one of the officers gave me his card and said to call if anything came to mind, no matter how insignificant it might seem. I spent that night staring at his card, trying to work up the courage to call and explain what I'd seen online. But every time I reached for my phone, I'd think about having to admit I'd accessed those illegal websites, about potentially being prosecuted for involvement in something I'd stumbled into by accident. The third time they came to my door, they weren't there for routine inquiries. They'd apparently received information that connected me to the online community somehow. I never learned exactly how they'd traced me, but presumably the people running those websites kept records that law enforcement had eventually accessed. The officers explained that they knew I'd accessed certain websites and communities, and they wanted to know what I'd seen there. They weren't arresting me or accusing me of involvement in Sarah Chen's murder, but they needed any information I had about the discussions and coordination that had happened online. That's when I finally told them everything. About the insomnia support group, that wasn't what it seemed. About stumbling into sections discussing illegal activities. About the specific thread discussing Sarah Chen and the photographs documenting her movements. About reading those discussions and understanding enough to know she was in danger, but convincing myself it wasn't my responsibility to report it. The officers were professional, but I could see the frustration in their expressions. If I'd reported what I'd seen immediately, they might have been able to intervene before Sarah Chen was killed. My delay had potentially cost her life, even if I wasn't directly involved in planning or executing the murder. They took detailed statements about everything I'd seen in those discussions. Usernames I remembered, specific details about what had been posted, even technical information about how I'd accessed the community in the first place. Then they explained that I'd need to be placed in protective custody while they investigated the extent of my involvement and determined whether the people running those communities knew I'd spoken to police. That's how I ended up in this safe house in Wolverhampton, waiting to find out if I'll be prosecuted for accessing those websites or if my cooperation has earned me some form of immunity. The officers who check on me daily have explained that the investigation is expanding beyond just Sarah Chen's murder. They've discovered extensive criminal coordination happening through that community, including planning for additional violent crimes that haven't been carried out yet. They've asked me to testify about what I saw, to help them understand how the community was organized and how people coordinated their activities. I've agreed, partly because I want to help prevent what happened to Sarah Chen from happening to anyone else, and partly because I'm hoping cooperation will reduce whatever legal consequences I'm facing for accessing those websites. But mostly I've agreed because I'm living with the knowledge that I could have prevented a murder and chose not to because I was too frightened of the personal consequences of coming forward. I saw someone being targeted for violence, understood enough to know she was in real danger, and convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to get involved. The protection officer who stays here overnight tells me not to blame myself too much, that people make difficult decisions when they're frightened and uncertain about consequences. But I can't stop thinking about Sarah Chen, going about her ordinary life in those photographs completely unaware that her movements were being documented and discussed by people planning to kill her. And I can't stop wondering about all the other discussions I saw in those verified sections, all the other targets who might be in danger while people coordinate harm against them through those same coded conversations. The investigation is ongoing and police are apparently making arrests, but they've told me the community was large and distributed across multiple platforms, making it difficult to identify everyone involved. I spend most of my time in this safe house thinking about how easily I stumbled into that community, how a simple search for insomnia help led me to discover systematic coordination of serious crimes. How many other people have accidentally accessed those spaces and then kept quiet because they were frightened of consequences? The protection officer also mentioned that I might be in danger from people who ran that community if they've identified me as someone who spoke to police. Apparently, there have been incidents of witnesses being targeted by criminal networks operating through these hidden online spaces, though she was vague about details. So now I sit here waiting to learn both whether I'll be prosecuted for accessing those websites and whether I'm in danger from the people who ran them, waiting to testify about what I saw, about the discussions coordinating Sarah Chen's murder that I read and understood and did nothing about until it was too late. The insomnia that started this whole situation has gotten worse, not better. I lie awake now thinking about those photographs of Sarah Chen, wondering if she ever felt like she was being watched, if she ever had that uncomfortable sense that something wasn't right, wondering if my reporting the discussions earlier would have made any difference, or if the coordination was already too far along to stop. The police have told me they found evidence in the arrested suspect's possessions that matched details from the discussions I described, proof that those online conversations weren't just disturbing fantasies, but actual coordination of real crimes. Multiple people working together to stalk, target, and ultimately kill someone they'd probably never met before, deciding she'd be their victim. They won't tell me why Sarah Chen was targeted or how she'd been selected, just that she appears to have been chosen somewhat randomly by people who treated violence as a form of entertainment or social bonding. The thought that someone could be murdered, not for any specific reason, but just because strangers online decided to coordinate killing someone, is almost more disturbing than any other explanation. I keep thinking about how I accessed that community looking for help with insomnia, seeking connection with other people struggling with the same ordinary problem. How that simple, harmless desire for community and understanding led me to discover the coordination of a murder. How easily I could have never seen those discussions, never learned what was being planned, never carried this knowledge that I could have prevented someone's death. The protection officer tells me the investigation has led to multiple arrests and prevented at least one other planned attack that was being coordinated through the same community. She says my information was valuable and helped police understand how these groups operate and coordinate their activities. But that doesn't change the fact that Sarah Chen is dead and I saw it being planned and stayed silent. I don't know what happens next, whether I'll be able to return to my normal life or whether I'll always be looking over my shoulder wondering if the people from that community are looking for me, whether I'll face prosecution for accessing those websites or whether my cooperation will be considered sufficient mitigation. What I do know is that I'll never again think of the internet as a space where criminal activity is somehow distant or unreal. I've seen real violence being planned through casual online discussions, seen how easily people can coordinate serious harm through these hidden communities that most people don't even know exist. And I'll never forget Sarah Chen's face in those photographs, going about her ordinary life completely unaware that strangers were watching and planning and coordinating the violence that would eventually kill her. Never forget that I could have prevented it and chose not to, because I was frightened of consequences that now seem trivial compared to the cost of my silence. I keep telling myself I should have walked away when the money seemed too good to be legitimate. But when you're freelancing and barely covering your bills, it's easy to convince yourself that sometimes you just get lucky with well-paying clients. Even now, months later, I can't decide whether I was naive or just desperate enough to ignore the obvious warning signs. The whole thing started with what seemed like a perfectly ordinary translation job. I'd been working as a freelance translator for about 2 years, mostly handling business documents and tourist materials for companies around the Midlands. The work was steady, but not particularly well paid, and I was always looking for clients who might offer better rates. I specialize in Eastern European languages, particularly Polish and Czech, which aren't exactly in high demand in most of the UK. Most of my work came through agencies that paid a fraction of what direct clients would offer. But finding those direct clients was proving more difficult than I'd expected when I first went freelance. So when I received an email from someone claiming to represent a research organization that needed regular translation services, I was immediately interested. They explained that they worked with academic institutions across Europe and needed someone who could handle sensitive documents that required discretion and accuracy. The initial email was professional and detailed, explaining that they often dealt with materials that weren't suitable for larger translation agencies due to confidentiality requirements. They were looking for an individual translator who could work independently and maintain strict confidentiality about their projects. They offered to pay nearly double my usual rates, which should have made me suspicious. But they explained that the premium was due to the confidential nature of the work and the quick turnaround times they typically required. When you're struggling to make rent, that kind of explanation sounds reasonable enough. We arranged a video call to discuss the specifics of what they needed. The person I spoke with seemed knowledgeable about translation work and asked sensible questions about my experience and capabilities. They explained that their research involved social and cultural studies, which often required analysis of materials that weren't readily available through conventional sources. The first job they sent me was straightforward enough. About a dozen pages of what appeared to be forum posts and private messages in Polish, discussing various social and political topics. Nothing obviously sensitive or concerning, just the sort of online conversations you might find on any social media platform. My task was to translate these posts while preserving the conversational tone and any cultural references that might be important for understanding the context. They emphasized that accuracy was crucial, particularly for any references to specific people, places, or events mentioned in the messages. I completed the work within their deadline and received payment the same day, exactly as promised. The client seemed satisfied with my work and immediately offered me another similar project. This time, it was Czech forum posts, again focusing on social and political discussions. Over the following weeks, I received regular translation jobs from this client. The work was always similar. Online conversations and forum posts in various Eastern European languages, with an emphasis on preserving cultural context and specific references. The content gradually became more personal and detailed. Instead of general social discussions, I was translating private messages between individuals discussing their personal lives, work situations, and family circumstances. The tone suggested these were meant to be confidential communications rather than public forum posts. When I mentioned to the client that some of the material seemed quite personal, they explained that their research involved studying authentic communication patterns in different cultural contexts. They needed examples of how people actually communicated online, rather than the more formal language used in official documents or published materials. This seemed like a reasonable explanation for an academic research project. Understanding how people actually communicate online would require access to genuine conversations rather than sanitized examples designed for public consumption. The pay continued to be excellent, and the work was intellectually interesting. I was learning about communication patterns and cultural differences that I'd never encountered in my regular commercial translation work. The client seemed pleased with my accuracy and attention to detail, often commenting specifically on how well I'd captured the nuances of particular conversations. Around the 6th week, they began sending me materials that were clearly more sensitive. Private messages discussing illegal activities, conversations about avoiding law enforcement, and detailed discussions of criminal enterprises. Nothing that directly involved violence, but definitely conversations that the participants wouldn't want to become public. When I raised concerns about translating what appeared to be evidence of criminal activity, the client assured me that all materials were being used for legitimate academic research into online criminal communities. They explained that understanding how these communities communicate was important for developing strategies to combat organized crime. They also reminded me of the confidentiality agreement I'd signed at the beginning of our working relationship, which included provisions about not discussing the content of materials I translated with anyone outside their organization. The explanation seemed plausible enough. Law enforcement and academic institutions do study criminal communication patterns, and translation services would be a necessary part of that research. I convinced myself that I was contributing to important work that might help combat serious crime. But the materials I was translating began to include increasingly specific information about real people and activities, names, addresses, business operations, and detailed plans for various illegal enterprises. The level of detail suggested that these weren't just random examples of criminal communication, but intelligence about active criminal operations. Some of the conversations I translated included references to people and places in the UK, particularly in areas I recognized from living in the Midlands. The participants were discussing operations and activities that were clearly taking place in my local area, rather than the distant Eastern European context I'd initially assumed. When I realized that I was translating intelligence about criminal activities happening near where I lived, I became much more uncomfortable with the work. This wasn't abstract academic research about online communication patterns. It was detailed information about real crimes being planned and executed in my own region. I tried to discuss these concerns with my client, but their response was less reassuring than before. They explained that their research necessarily involved studying active criminal networks rather than historical examples, and that the geographic distribution of their materials reflected the international nature of modern organized crime. They also mentioned that my translations had been particularly valuable because of my familiarity with UK cultural references and regional variations in the areas being discussed. This suggested that they had specifically chosen me because of my location and local knowledge, rather than just my language skills. This realization made me deeply uncomfortable. I hadn't been hired as a general translator, but specifically because my background made me useful for understanding criminal activities in my local area. The client had identified me as someone who could provide cultural context for intelligence about crimes happening in my own region. When I tried to reduce my involvement with their projects, the client became more insistent about the importance of my continued participation. They explained that I had developed valuable expertise in understanding the specific communication patterns used by the criminal networks they were studying, and that replacing me would significantly disrupt their research. They also reminded me that I had already translated significant amounts of sensitive material, and that my knowledge of their research methods and sources made me an important part of their security considerations. Ending our working relationship abruptly could create complications for their ongoing projects. The implication was that I knew too much about their operations to simply walk away. I had detailed knowledge of their research methods, their sources of information, and the specific criminal networks they were monitoring. From their perspective, I had become a security risk that needed to be managed rather than simply dismissed. Over the following weeks, the client began requesting additional services beyond basic translation. They wanted me to provide cultural context for the materials I was translating, explaining regional references and local knowledge that might not be obvious to someone unfamiliar with the areas being discussed. These requests required me to research the people and places mentioned in the materials I was translating. I found myself looking up addresses, business premises, and individuals referenced in the criminal conversations, ostensibly to provide better context for the translations. But this research was effectively turning me into an intelligence gatherer rather than just a translator. I was using my local knowledge and research skills to build detailed profiles of the people and places involved in the criminal activities described in the materials. The client seemed particularly interested in my research into individuals mentioned in the conversations. They requested detailed background information about people whose names appeared in the materials, including their employment history, family connections, and social media presence. This crossed a clear line from translation work into active intelligence gathering. I was no longer just converting text from one language to another. I was conducting surveillance research on real people, based on information I discovered through translating intercepted communications. When I tried to refuse these additional research tasks, the client pointed out that my translation work had already made me complicit in their intelligence operations. I had detailed knowledge of their sources and methods, and I had been contributing to their understanding of criminal networks for several months. They suggested that my concerns about the ethics of intelligence gathering were somewhat late, given that I had already been participating in their operations for weeks without raising objections. From their perspective, I was already a full participant in their activities, rather than just a service provider. The client also began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances and activities that they couldn't have gathered through our professional relationship. References to my daily routine, my social connections, and my financial situation that suggested they had been conducting background research into my own life. This pattern of surveillance became more obvious over the following days. The client would mention details about my activities that I hadn't shared with them, presented as casual observations, but clearly intended to demonstrate their knowledge of my personal life. I realized that while I had been researching the people mentioned in the materials I was translating, the client had been conducting similar research into my own background and circumstances. I had become both an intelligence gatherer and a surveillance target. The client explained that background checks on all their contractors were standard security practice, and that my personal information was simply part of their routine risk assessment procedures. They assured me that this information would remain confidential as long as I continued to meet my professional obligations. But the message was clear. They had comprehensive information about my life and circumstances, and they were prepared to use that information to ensure my continued cooperation with their projects. I tried to end the arrangement by simply stopping communication and refusing new projects, but discovered that the client had backup methods for maintaining contact. Messages began appearing through my personal social media accounts, and I received calls at home from people claiming to need translation services for urgent academic projects. The surveillance of my daily activities became more obvious, with clear signs that my movements were being monitored and documented. Not threatening behavior, but obvious enough to make it clear that my decision to stop working with them wasn't being accepted. This continued for several weeks, with regular contact attempts and demonstrations that they maintained detailed knowledge of my routine and activities. The message was that ending our professional relationship wouldn't necessarily end their interest in my circumstances and activities. The pressure only stopped when I moved to a different city and changed most of my contact information. Even then, I received occasional messages for several months, suggesting that they were still attempting to re-establish our working relationship. I never determined who the client actually represented or what they were really using my translations for. The materials could have been legitimate intelligence gathered by law enforcement, evidence collected by journalists investigating organized crime, or intelligence being used by competing criminal organizations. What I do know is that they understood how to exploit the freelance economy to recruit people for intelligence work that they would never have agreed to if they'd understood the full scope from the beginning. They presented criminal intelligence gathering as academic research and used financial pressure to ensure continued cooperation even when ethical concerns arose. The most disturbing aspect was how gradually I'd been drawn into increasingly invasive activities. Each step seemed like a reasonable extension of the previous work, until I was conducting active surveillance research on real people based on intercepted criminal communications. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar clients, offering translation work for research projects that require discretion and cultural expertise. The pay rates are always generous. The initial projects always seem legitimate, and the communication methods are always more complex than necessary. I delete these messages immediately now, but I wonder how many other freelance translators have found themselves in similar situations, gradually recruited into intelligence operations that they never intended to participate in. I wish I'd never answered that bloody advert. Even writing this down makes me feel sick, but I keep thinking someone else might see the same kind of job posting and make the same mistake I did. When you're desperate enough for work, you tell yourself that any opportunity is worth considering, even when everything about it feels wrong from the start. The advert appeared on one of those local Facebook groups where people sell furniture and advertise cleaning services. Nothing fancy or suspicious looking, just a simple post asking for someone to help with elderly care in Wolverhampton. The pay was decent, about £12 an hour for what seemed like basic companionship and light housekeeping. I'd been unemployed for 3 months by then, ever since the bakery where I worked had closed down. The owner had been struggling with rising costs and finally decided to sell up, rather than keep fighting to stay afloat. Most of the staff had found other jobs fairly quickly, but I was in my late 40s and discovering that age discrimination is alive and well in the retail sector. My savings had run out weeks earlier, and I was already behind on my council tax. The job centre wasn't much help. They kept suggesting I retrain for completely different careers, as if starting over at my age was a realistic option. I'd applied for dozens of positions, but most employers seemed to lose interest once they met me in person and realized I wasn't the young, energetic candidate they'd been hoping for. So when I saw the elderly care advert, I responded immediately. The work would be looking after an older gentleman in his 70s who needed assistance with daily activities but wasn't ready for a care home. His family lived abroad and were looking for someone reliable to check on him regularly and help with shopping, cooking, and general companionship. The person who replied to my message seemed professional enough. They explained that the gentleman, who they referred to as Mr. Phillips, had been living independently until recently, but was becoming forgetful and needed someone to ensure he was eating properly and taking his medication. Nothing too demanding, just the sort of basic care that keeps elderly people safe in their own homes. We arranged to meet at a cafe in Wolverhampton's city centre to discuss the details. The woman who met me was probably in her 30s, well dressed, and spoke with an accent I couldn't quite place. She introduced herself as Sarah and explained that she worked for a private care agency that specialized in finding suitable carers for elderly clients who preferred to remain in their own homes. Sarah showed me photographs of Mr. Phillips and his house, a modest, semi-detached property in a quiet residential area. She explained that he was generally in good health, but had been having episodes of confusion and memory loss that worried his family. They needed someone to visit twice daily to ensure he was managing his basic needs and to keep an eye on his general well-being. The job would involve morning and evening visits, helping with meals, ensuring medications were taken correctly, and providing social interaction to prevent isolation. Sarah emphasized that Mr. Phillips valued his independence and didn't want someone who would take over his daily routine, just assistance with the things he was finding difficult to manage alone. The pay was exactly as advertised, with the possibility of additional hours if Mr. Phillips needed extra support during illness or periods of increased confusion. Sarah explained that the family were willing to pay well because they wanted someone reliable who would treat their father with dignity and respect. I started the following Monday. Sarah drove me to the house and introduced me to Mr. Phillips, who seemed pleasant enough despite being obviously confused about who I was and why I was there. He kept referring to me by different names and asking whether I was there to fix something in the house. Sarah explained that this was typical behavior and that I shouldn't worry about correcting him or trying to orient him to reality. The important thing was to ensure he felt comfortable and safe, regardless of what he believed about the situation. She suggested going along with his misconceptions rather than challenging them, as this would reduce his anxiety and make the visits more pleasant for both of us. The house was exactly as Sarah had described, clean but obviously lived in, with the sort of accumulated clutter that builds up over decades of settled living. Mr. Phillips had clearly been managing reasonably well until recently, but there were signs that his routine was beginning to break down. Unwashed dishes in the sink, expired food in the refrigerator, and prescription bottles that suggested he wasn't taking his medications consistently. My first few visits were straightforward enough. I'd arrive in the morning to help with breakfast and ensure Mr. Phillips had taken his morning medications, then return in the evening to prepare a simple meal and check that he was settled for the night. He was generally cooperative, though he often seemed confused about why I was there and what I was supposed to be doing. The confusion wasn't consistent. Some days he seemed perfectly lucid and would chat normally about his garden, his neighbors, or television programs he'd been watching. Other days, he barely seemed to recognize me and would ask repeatedly whether I was supposed to be there and when his family would be coming to visit. Sarah had prepared me for this variability, explaining that dementia often involves good days and bad days, rather than a steady decline. She emphasized that my role was to provide consistent support regardless of his mental state, ensuring his basic needs were met even when he couldn't remember why I was helping him. After about 2 weeks, I began noticing things about Mr. Phillips's situation that didn't quite match what Sarah had told me during our initial meeting. The medications he was taking didn't seem consistent with the memory problems she'd described. Instead of the dementia medications I'd expected, most of his prescriptions were for conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes. When I mentioned this to Sarah during one of her weekly check-in calls, she explained that Mr. Phillips was in the early stages of cognitive decline and hadn't yet been prescribed specific dementia medications. The confusion I was witnessing was due to the progression of his condition rather than the effects of particular treatments. This seemed plausible enough, and I didn't have medical training that would help me evaluate his condition independently. I continued with the routine we'd established, focusing on ensuring he was eating regularly and taking his prescribed medications correctly. But I also started noticing that Mr. Phillips's confusion seemed to follow specific patterns. He was consistently confused about recent events and current circumstances, but his memory of older events seemed perfectly intact. He could describe his childhood in detail, remember the names of school friends from decades ago, and provide accurate information about his work history and family background. This selective memory loss struck me as unusual, though again, I wasn't qualified to assess whether it was consistent with normal dementia progression. When I raised this observation with Sarah, she explained that long-term memory often remains intact much longer than short-term memory in dementia patients, and that what I was seeing was entirely typical. Around the fourth week, Mr. Phillips began asking me questions that suggested his confusion might not be as complete as I'd assumed. He wanted to know specific details about why his family had arranged for care when they had last visited, and why they weren't answering his phone calls. These questions made me realize that I actually knew very little about Mr. Phillips's family situation beyond what Sarah had told me. I'd never spoken directly with his relatives, seen any documentation about his care arrangements, or been given contact information for family members in case of emergencies. When I asked Sarah for more details about Mr. Phillips's family and their involvement in his care arrangements, her responses became noticeably vague. She explained that the family preferred to handle communication through the care agency rather than directly with individual carers, and that this was standard practice for clients who had relatives living abroad. This explanation seemed reasonable from a professional standpoint, but it meant I had no way of verifying that Mr. Phillips's family were actually aware of or had approved the care arrangements. I was taking Sarah's word for everything about his situation and the legitimacy of my employment. I began paying more attention to the details of Mr. Phillips's living situation and discovered several things that didn't align with Sarah's descriptions of his circumstances. The house showed no signs of recent family visits, no photographs, cards, or personal items that suggested ongoing contact with relatives who cared about his well-being. More concerning was the lack of any official documentation related to his care needs. No letters from doctors, social services, or family members discussing his condition or care requirements. The house felt like it belonged to someone who was isolated rather than someone whose caring family were coordinating support from abroad. When I tried to discuss these observations with Mr. Phillips during one of his more lucid periods, his responses suggested that he wasn't aware of having family members who were involved in arranging his care. He seemed genuinely confused about why someone had been hired to help him and couldn't provide any details about relatives who might have made these arrangements. This conversation made me deeply uncomfortable about the legitimacy of my employment. If Mr. Phillips didn't understand why I was there and had no knowledge of family members arranging care, it was possible that someone else had made these arrangements without his knowledge or consent. I tried calling Sarah to discuss these concerns, but discovered that the phone number she'd given me was no longer working. When I searched for the care agency she claimed to represent, I couldn't find any online presence or official registration that would confirm its legitimacy. This forced me to consider the possibility that my employment was not what it had been presented as. Instead of providing legitimate elderly care, I might be participating in some form of exploitation or fraud, targeting a vulnerable older person. I decided to contact the local social services department to report my concerns about Mr. Phillips's situation. When I explained his circumstances and my role in his care, the social worker I spoke with had no record of any official care arrangements for someone matching his description. The social worker agreed to conduct a welfare check and asked me to continue visiting Mr. Phillips until they could assess his situation properly. They emphasized that if he was indeed vulnerable and living without appropriate support, suddenly withdrawing the assistance I'd been providing could put him at risk. When the social worker visited the house the following day, they discovered that Mr. Phillips had no official care arrangements and no family members who had requested support services. His confusion about his circumstances was not due to dementia, but to medication that had been added to his daily routine without his knowledge or consent. The medications I'd been helping him take included substances that were causing memory problems and disorientation. Someone had been systematically drugging him to create the appearance of cognitive decline, presumably to justify the presence of a carer who could monitor and control his daily activities. The social worker explained that this was a form of elder abuse that involved isolating vulnerable older people and gaining control over their lives through manipulation and medication. The perpetrators often posed as care agencies or family representatives to recruit unwitting accomplices who would help maintain the deception. I realized that I had been recruited not to provide legitimate care, but to participate in the systematic abuse of a vulnerable older person. My daily visits had been used to ensure that Mr. Phillips continued taking medication that was harming him, while also providing intelligence about his routine and circumstances to whoever was orchestrating the abuse. The investigation that followed revealed that several other elderly people in the area had been targeted by similar schemes. In each case, fake care agencies had recruited carers who believed they were providing legitimate services, while actually participating in systematic abuse and exploitation. Mr. Phillips recovered fully once the harmful medications were removed from his routine. His confusion and memory problems disappeared within days, revealing that he had been competent and independent until someone had begun systematically drugging him to create the appearance of vulnerability. I never found out who had been behind the fake care agency or what their ultimate goals had been. The investigation suggested that the scheme involved accessing victims' homes and personal information, possibly as preparation for financial exploitation or other forms of abuse. What I do know is that I had spent weeks helping to abuse someone I thought I was caring for. My daily visits had been used to ensure that a vulnerable older person continued to receive medication that was harming him, while also gathering intelligence about his circumstances that could be used for further exploitation. The experience taught me that elder abuse often relies on recruiting well-meaning people who believe they're providing legitimate care services. The perpetrators understand how to exploit people's desire to help vulnerable older adults, using that compassion to recruit accomplices who would never willingly participate in abuse if they understood what they were really being asked to do. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar care agencies, offering employment opportunities that seem too good to be true for someone with my limited qualifications. The pay rates are always generous, the initial meetings always seem professional, and the elderly clients always seem to need exactly the sort of basic assistance that any caring person would want to provide. I reject these offers immediately now, but I wonder how many other people have found themselves in similar situations believing they were helping vulnerable older adults while actually participating in their systematic abuse and exploitation. Picture this. You're scrolling through your emails one morning and find an invitation to an exclusive event. Premium location, limited attendance, significant financial reward for participation. The kind of opportunity that seems too good to be true, but legitimate enough that you don't immediately delete it. Now picture discovering that the event isn't what you thought it was, and by the time you realize what you've agreed to, it's far too late to back out. I work in market research for a consultancy firm in Leeds. Nothing glamorous. Consumer surveys, focus groups, the occasional product launch analysis. The pay is decent enough, but it's the kind of job where you're always looking for ways to supplement your income. Freelance work, weekend surveys, anything that might add a few £100 to your monthly earnings. That's why the email caught my attention. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with the usual spam and work correspondence. The subject line was simple enough. Research opportunity, exclusive participation required. The sender was someone called Dr. Sarah Chen from something called the Institute for Behavioral Studies. The email was professionally written, explaining that they were conducting a specialized research project on group dynamics and social behavior. They needed participants with specific qualifications, university educated, working in research or analysis, comfortable with technology and unconventional research methods. The compensation was substantial. £500 for a single evening's participation, with the possibility of ongoing work for suitable candidates. I looked up the Institute for Behavioral Studies online. They had a legitimate-looking website, published research papers, even a few academic staff profiles. Dr. Chen appeared to be a real person with proper credentials from Manchester University. Everything seemed above board, if a bit vague about the actual nature of the research. The application process was straightforward. Basic personal information, employment history, some questions about my comfort level with technology, and unusual research scenarios. They asked about my experience with online platforms, whether I'd used secure communication tools, how I felt about observing human behavior in controlled environments. Within a week, I received confirmation that I'd been selected for the study. The details were sparse but intriguing. I would need to attend a briefing session in Manchester, followed by the main research event later that evening. All travel expenses would be covered, plus the £500 participation fee. The only requirement was that I sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement before the briefing. The location was a serviced office building near Manchester city centre. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of research companies rent temporary spaces for focus groups and studies. I arrived on the specified date to find about 20 other people in the waiting area, all roughly my age and background, all looking slightly puzzled about what they'd signed up for. Dr. Chen turned out to be exactly as advertised. A professional academic in her 40s, well-spoken and authoritative. She explained that we would be participating in a study of group behavior and decision-making in high-pressure situations. The research involved observing and interacting with subjects in a controlled environment, measuring our responses to various scenarios. The technology component, she explained, was necessary for participant privacy and research integrity. We would be accessing the observation environment through a secure network, using encrypted connections to ensure anonymity. Each participant would be given a laptop with pre-installed software for the session. We were led to individual workstations in a larger room, each with a laptop and a set of instructions. The software we needed to use was something called Tor Browser. which Dr. Chen explained was standard for research requiring participant anonymity. We would be accessing a private research platform that could only be reached through this secure network. The initial briefing made it sound like a sophisticated version of reality television. We would be observing people in various scenarios and making decisions about how situations should develop. Our choices would be aggregated with other participants to determine the direction of the research. It was described as a study of collective decision-making and moral reasoning under pressure. The platform, when we accessed it, looked professional enough. Clean interface, clear instructions, participant guidelines. We were told we would be observing subjects who had volunteered for a separate study and consented to being filmed. Our role was to vote on various scenarios and observe how different situations affected group dynamics. The first session seemed innocuous. We were watching what appeared to be a focus group. 8 people sitting around a table discussing consumer preferences. Our job was to vote on which topics the moderator should introduce next, how the discussion should be guided, what questions would be most revealing about group behavior. It felt like legitimate research, the kind of thing you might see in any market research facility across the country. The participants seemed natural, unaware they were being observed by external researchers. We made our votes through the platform interface, and the focus group moderator would adjust their questioning accordingly. After about an hour, Dr. Chen explained that the next phase would be more intensive. The subjects would be moved to individual observation rooms, where we could study their behavior in isolation. This was where the real research would begin, understanding how people behaved when they thought they were alone, versus how they acted in groups. The individual observation sessions were more uncomfortable. We were watching people in what looked like small windowless rooms, apparently unaware they were being filmed. The platform allowed us to vote on various environmental changes, adjusting lighting, temperature, introducing background noises. The idea was to measure stress responses and coping mechanisms. I started to feel uneasy about the whole thing. The people we were observing seemed genuinely distressed by some of the environmental changes. When we voted to increase the room temperature, we could see them becoming visibly uncomfortable. When background noise was introduced, they showed clear signs of agitation and confusion. Dr. Chen explained that this was normal for behavioral research. The subjects had consented to psychological stress testing as part of their participation agreement. What we were seeing was valuable data about human resilience and adaptation. The distress was temporary and carefully controlled to avoid lasting harm. But as the evening progressed, the scenarios became more extreme. We were voting on whether to restrict access to water, whether to introduce disturbing sounds, whether to dim the lights to near darkness. The people we were observing were showing increasing signs of panic and distress. The platform interface had evolved too. Instead of simple voting options, we were now bidding on scenarios using virtual credits. The higher the bid, the more likely our chosen option would be implemented. It had turned into a kind of auction system, with participants competing to direct the action. Some of the other participants seemed to be enjoying it. I could hear suppressed laughter from nearby workstations when particularly distressing scenarios were implemented. People were bidding aggressively on options that would cause maximum psychological pressure on the subjects. I tried to bid on less harmful options to counteract what the others were doing, but I quickly realized that some people were bidding with what seemed like unlimited virtual credits. Whatever system was in place, some participants had far more influence than others. The worst part was watching the subject's deterioration. What had started as mild discomfort had escalated to genuine terror. These people were trapped in small rooms, subjected to psychological pressure that was clearly beyond anything they could have consented to. and we were the ones directing it, voting on new ways to torment them. I tried to close the laptop and leave, but Dr. Chen approached my workstation. She explained quietly that participants were required to complete the full session to receive payment. More importantly, the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed included specific penalties for early withdrawal or breach of confidentiality. The penalties were substantial. Several £1,000s in compensation for disrupted research. So I stayed. I watched as the scenarios became increasingly extreme, as the subjects were pushed beyond psychological breaking points. I made token bids on harmless options while others seemed to compete for the most creative forms of torment. By the end of the session, several of the subjects had suffered what appeared to be complete psychological breakdowns. They were catatonic, unresponsive, clearly traumatized by whatever they'd experienced in those rooms. The platform recorded our collective decisions and thanked us for our participation in the research study. Dr. Chen provided payment as promised, along with contact information for future research opportunities. She reminded us of our confidentiality obligations and the legal consequences of discussing the research with anyone outside the authorized team. I left Manchester that night feeling sick about what I'd witnessed and participated in. But I also had £500 in my account and the promise of more work if I was interested. The money was more than I made in a week at my regular job. Over the following days, I tried to research the Institute for Behavioral Studies more thoroughly. The website was still there, but when I looked more carefully, the academic papers seemed to be fake. The staff profiles used stock photos, and the university affiliations couldn't be verified. I also started to doubt whether what I'd witnessed was actually research at all. The whole setup felt more like entertainment than academic study. The bidding system, the competitive element, the focus on causing distress rather than understanding behavior, it all suggested something much darker than legitimate research, but I couldn't report it without implicating myself. I'd signed legal documents, participated willingly, even made decisions that contributed to whatever those people had suffered. Any investigation would reveal my involvement and potentially lead to the legal consequences Dr. Chen had warned about. 2 weeks later, I received another invitation. Same format, same professional presentation. But this time, the compensation was higher, £1,000 for participation. The email mentioned that I'd been selected for a premium research program based on my previous contributions. I should have deleted it immediately. Should have blocked the sender and tried to forget the whole thing had ever happened. But £1,000 was substantial money, and I told myself that maybe I could participate without actively contributing to harm. Maybe I could bid on harmless options, try to protect the subjects rather than torment them. The second session was worse, much worse. The subjects weren't just being psychologically pressured, they were being physically harmed, not severely, but deliberately and systematically. Small injuries, controlled pain, careful degradation designed to break them down completely. And the other participants were enthusiastic about it. They were bidding enormous amounts on scenarios that would cause maximum suffering. The virtual credit system had been replaced with what looked like real money, pounds sterling being transferred in real time to implement specific forms of torture. I realized I wasn't participating in research at all. I was part of an audience paying to watch and direct real torture, broadcast live through the dark web to paying customers around the world. The professional presentation, the academic credentials, the research terminology, it was all camouflage for something much more sinister. The subjects weren't volunteers who had consented to psychological testing. They were victims, probably kidnapped or coerced, being tortured for the entertainment of people wealthy enough to pay premium prices for customized suffering. And I was one of them. By participating, by staying silent, by accepting payment for my involvement, I'd become part of a network that treated human torture as interactive entertainment. The sessions continued monthly. Each time, the compensation increased and the scenarios became more extreme. I told myself I was trying to minimize harm by bidding on less severe options, but I knew I was just rationalizing my continued participation. The money was addictive. Thousands of pounds for a few hours of watching screens and clicking buttons. More than I made in months at my regular job. It let me move to a better flat, buy things I'd never been able to afford, live a lifestyle that would have been impossible on my normal salary. But I also knew that every session I attended meant more people were being tortured for entertainment. Real people suffering real pain, while audiences around the world paid to watch and participate in their degradation. The network was vast. What I thought was a small research study was actually one node in a global system. There were hundreds of these sessions running simultaneously, different themes and scenarios for different audiences. The technology allowed real-time interaction between viewers and victims, turning torture into a personalized entertainment service. The worst part was realizing how many people were involved. The sessions I attended had dozens of participants, each paying substantial amounts for the privilege of directing human suffering. Multiply that across hundreds of simultaneous sessions, and you're looking at thousands of people who treat torture as entertainment. These weren't criminals or social outcasts. They were people with professional jobs, disposable income, the technical knowledge to access dark web platforms. They were probably colleagues, neighbors, maybe even friends and family members. Normal people who had found a way to pay for something monstrous, while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. I still receive invitations to new sessions, premium events, exclusive content, opportunities to direct increasingly extreme scenarios. The compensation offers have reached amounts that would change my life permanently. Enough money to quit my job, buy a house, never worry about financial security again. And I'm tempted. Not because I enjoy watching people suffer, but because the money would solve every problem I have. Because it's easy to rationalize participation when the alternative is returning to financial stress and career uncertainty. The invitations come from different sources now, but they're clearly part of the same network. Academic institutions, research organizations, market research companies, all fronts for the same underlying system. They've probably identified thousands of potential participants, people with the right combination of financial need and moral flexibility to become part of their audience. The person sitting next to you at work might have attended one of these sessions last night. Your university lecturer, your doctor, your neighbor, any of them could be supplementing their income by paying to watch and direct real torture. And the victims could be anyone. People who responded to job advertisements, answered research invitations, trusted professional-looking organizations. People like me, who thought they were participating in legitimate work until it was too late to back out. The next time you see a research invitation with unusually high compensation, or a job opportunity that seems too good to be true, remember that some offers are designed to compromise you gradually, to make you complicit in something horrible through small steps and financial incentives. You might already be on their lists. They might already know exactly what compensation amount would be enough to make you consider participating. What professional presentation would convince you it was legitimate? And once you've attended one session, once you've accepted payment for your participation, you're part of the network whether you want to be or not, because they know that most people, faced with the choice between exposing themselves or staying silent, will choose to protect their own interests, just like I did. I need to tell someone about this, even if no one believes me, even if it sounds completely mad. I've carried it around for 18 months now, and the weight of it is destroying me. Every time I see a missing person poster, every time there's a news story about someone who's vanished, I wonder if they found the same thing I did, if they're gone because of it. I was living in Norwich then, working as a dental hygienist. My life was predictable in that comfortable way that makes you feel safe but slightly dead inside. Same patients every 6 months, same conversations about flossing, same walk home along the river. I'd been single for about 2 years after a relationship that ended badly, and I'd gotten used to my own company, maybe too used to it. The dark web wasn't something I'd ever planned to explore, but after a documentary about online privacy, I got curious about what was actually on there. Spent a weekend learning how to access it safely, or as safely as you can access something inherently unsafe. I expected drugs, weapons, all the stuff you hear about. What I found was mostly just boring. Dead sites, broken links, things written in languages I didn't understand. But then I found something called the service. It was just a simple page with a search bar. No explanation, no about section, nothing to indicate what you were supposed to search for. I tried a few random words. Nothing came up. Tried some names of celebrities, thinking maybe it was one of those sites that leaked personal information. Still nothing. Then, out of boredom more than anything, I typed in my own name. One result appeared. A link with just my name and a string of numbers after it. My finger hovered over the mouse for a long time before I clicked it. The page that loaded was bizarrely mundane. It looked like a basic profile. My name, my age, my address in Norwich, a recent photo that looked like it had been taken on the street without my knowledge, my place of work, my regular coffee shop, the gym I'd just joined but barely used. Even my bloody Netflix viewing history somehow. Below all this information was a single line of text. Service available. There was a button next to it. Submit request. I should have closed it immediately. Should have shut the laptop and pretended I'd never seen it. But there was something so specifically threatening about that phrase. Service available. What service? Available to whom? I went back and searched other names. People I knew. My ex-boyfriend came up. Same format. Personal details, recent photo, that same line about service being available. My colleague, Rachel. My neighbor from 2 doors down. My cousin in Sheffield. Everyone I searched for had a profile. But not everyone had service available written on theirs. Some said service in progress. Others said service complete. Rachel said service complete. This bothered me because Rachel had been acting strange lately. She'd called in sick for 2 weeks, then come back seeming different, jumpy, kept checking her phone. Wouldn't eat lunch with us anymore, just sat in her car. I'd assumed she was going through something personal. I searched for more names, people I knew less well. The man who ran the corner shop near my flat, service in progress. A woman from my gym who'd suddenly stopped coming, service complete. My previous neighbor who'd moved away very suddenly last year, service complete. A pattern was forming that made my hands shake as I typed. I went back to my own profile and really studied it this time. The photo was recent, maybe 2 or 3 weeks old. I was wearing the new coat I'd bought in October. The information was current too, including the gym I'd only joined the previous month. Someone was keeping this updated. Below the submit request button, in tiny text I'd missed before, was a link that said view completed services. I clicked it. It was a gallery of some kind. Hundreds of profiles, but these were different. Each one had before and after sections. The before showed people like my profile, normal information, recent photos, daily routines. The after sections were what made me run to the bathroom to be sick. Some showed people who'd clearly been beaten, bruised faces, broken bones, fear in their eyes. Others showed people in what looked like captivity. Basement rooms, mattresses on floors, chains. But the worst ones, the ones that haunt me, were the ones that showed nothing. Just the word relocated under the after section. I recognized some faces. People from Norwich who'd gone missing over the past few years. A teenager who'd vanished walking home from school. A man who'd left for work and never arrived. They were all here, all marked as service complete. I went back to Rachel's profile with growing dread. Her after section showed her in what looked like a warehouse, sitting on a chair, staring at nothing. The photo was dated 2 weeks ago, when she'd been off sick, but she was back at work now. She was fine, wasn't she? The next day at work, I couldn't stop watching her. She seemed normal enough, if quieter than usual. But then I noticed something, a small scar on her neck that hadn't been there before. The way she flinched when anyone walked behind her, how she kept touching her wrist, like checking something was still there. During lunch, when she went to her car as usual, I followed. Watched from a distance as she sat in the driver's seat, not eating, not looking at her phone, just sitting. Then I saw her sleeve ride up. Bruises, dark ones, the kind that come from being held down. I wanted to talk to her, ask if she was okay, but how could I? How could I explain what I knew without admitting I'd been looking at her profile on some horrific, dark website? That night, I went back to the service. I needed to understand what this was, who was running it, what the submit request button actually did. This time, I noticed something new, a small counter in the corner of the main page. Active services, 47. I refreshed the page. Active services, 48. Someone, somewhere, had just submitted a request. I searched frantically through profiles of people I knew, looking for who'd just been marked. Found him after 20 minutes of searching. My ex-boyfriend's best friend, someone who'd always hated me, blamed me for the breakup. His status had changed from service available to service in progress. 3 days later, he was in the hospital. Supposedly a mugging gone wrong, but nothing was stolen. Both his legs were broken. He couldn't remember what happened, just waking up in an alley behind his flat. I checked the service. His status, service complete. That's when I understood. This wasn't just surveillance or stalking. This was a marketplace for violence. Submit a request on someone and something would happen to them. Beating, kidnapping, worse. All presented like ordering a pizza online. I tried to find out more about how it worked. Who was doing the actual violence? How people even knew this site existed. But the deeper I dug, the more frightened I became, because I started recognizing patterns in the completed services. The man who ran the corner shop, his completed service corresponded with his competition, another shop owner 3 streets over, having their status changed to service available the same day. Like it was payment, the woman from my gym, her ex-husband's status, had changed to service available the day after hers went to complete. It was a trade. Do something to someone, and you earned the right to have something done to someone else. I stopped sleeping, stopped going to work, just sat in my flat refreshing the service, watching the counter go up. Active services, 52, 53, 54. Then my own status changed. Service in progress. I ran. Packed nothing, just got in my car and drove. Stayed in different hotels every night, paid cash for everything, threw away my phone. But I couldn't resist checking the service from internet cafes. My status stayed the same for 2 weeks. Service in progress. Then, nothing. It went back to service available, like someone had cancelled the request. Or maybe they just couldn't find me. I've never been back to Norwich. I live in Scotland now. Different name, different job, always looking over my shoulder. I check the service sometimes when I can't help myself. It's still there, still active. The counter keeps going up. My old profile is still there too, with my Norwich address, my old job, photos from 2 years ago. Service available. But there's a new profile now, with my new name, my Scottish address, a photo from last month. Service available. I've thought about going to the police so many times, but with what evidence? Screenshots from an illegal website, stories about people I can't prove are connected, and more importantly, if the service is real, if there really are people out there fulfilling these requests, what happens if I become too much of a problem? There's something else I haven't told anyone. Last month, I saw my sister's profile appear for the first time. She lives in Bristol, has 2 kids, a normal life. Her status, service available, and right below it, that button. Submit request. Sometimes, late at night, I think about it, about who marked me, who wanted something done to me badly enough to do something to someone else first. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I think about my sister's profile, about how easy it would be to click that button, about who I'd have to hurt to keep her safe. The service is still there, still growing. Every day, more profiles, more services in progress, more people who have no idea they're on a list, available for violence at the click of a button. Every missing person, every unexplained assault, every sudden disappearance, I wonder if they're part of it. I wonder how many people know about it. How many have used it? How many have traded violence for violence, hurt for hurt? And I wonder when my status will change again. When someone, somewhere, will decide I'm worth the trade. When service in progress will appear next to my name again. Only this time, I might not see it coming. Sometimes I wonder if agreeing to help my cousin with her social experiment was the single worst decision I've ever made, because what started as a weekend favor turned into discovering that some people's idea of entertainment involves activities that would make most horror films seem tame by comparison. This happened about 8 months ago when I was living in Norwich, working as a children's librarian and trying to save enough money for a deposit on a better flat. My cousin Emma had just finished her sociology degree at UEA and was supposedly conducting independent research for her dissertation about online communities and social behavior. Emma had always been the clever one in our family, the type who got firsts in everything and talked about academic theories over Sunday dinner, while the rest of us discussed EastEnders. So when she asked if I'd help with her research project, I was flattered that she thought I could contribute something meaningful to actual university work. The experiment she described sounded straightforward enough. She wanted to study how ordinary people reacted when they were gradually introduced to online communities that existed outside mainstream social media platforms. Nothing dangerous, she assured me. Just documentation of psychological responses to different types of digital social environments. She'd already recruited several other participants, but needed someone with my demographic profile. Late 20s, limited technical knowledge, stable employment, but not particularly high income. Basically, she needed someone who represented what she called digital normalcy to round out her research sample. The methodology involved me spending designated time periods in various online communities, documenting my reactions and observations according to structured guidelines she'd developed. She'd pay me £200 for participating in what she estimated would be about 20 hours of research activity spread over several weeks. I should have asked more questions about what types of communities I'd be exploring, but Emma's academic enthusiasm was infectious, and I trusted that university research would have appropriate ethical oversight. Plus, £200 was significant money for someone living on a librarian's salary. She set me up with software on my laptop that would allow access to what she called alternative social platforms, communities that weren't part of the mainstream internet, but weren't necessarily hidden or secretive. Just different approaches to online social interaction that required specific tools to access. The first communities she directed me to were exactly what I'd expected from academic research. Discussion groups about political topics that were too controversial for Facebook. Hobby communities focused on interests that were too niche for general platforms. Even artistic spaces where people shared creative work that wouldn't get attention on commercial social media. Emma had prepared detailed questionnaires about my reactions to each community, how welcoming they seemed, whether the discussions felt authentic compared to mainstream platforms, what psychological needs these spaces seemed to fulfill for their participants. The academic framework made everything feel legitimate and purposeful. I was contributing to understanding of digital sociology while getting paid to explore parts of the internet I'd never encountered before. But as Emma guided me through different communities over the following weeks, the content started becoming more concerning in ways that felt deliberately progressive rather than randomly varied. Some communities were focused on sharing information that mainstream platforms wouldn't allow. Not necessarily illegal content, but material that violated typical social media policies about violence, harassment, or privacy violations. Others seemed designed around activities that most people would consider ethically questionable, like systematic documentation of strangers' private lives, or coordination of harassment campaigns against specific individuals. When I expressed concern about the increasingly extreme content, Emma explained that understanding the full spectrum of online social behavior required studying communities that operated outside conventional moral boundaries. Her research couldn't be comprehensive if it only examined socially acceptable digital spaces. She reminded me that anthropologists had always needed to study cultures and practices that might seem disturbing from outside perspectives, and that digital anthropology required the same willingness to document uncomfortable social realities. The academic justification made sense, and I found myself genuinely interested in the psychological questions her research was exploring. How did online communities develop their own moral frameworks? What social mechanisms allowed groups to normalize behavior that isolated individuals would recognize as inappropriate? Emma seemed particularly interested in my reactions to communities that focused on what they called social observation, systematic monitoring and documentation of people who weren't aware they were being watched. These communities treated surveillance of strangers as legitimate research into authentic human behavior, arguing that people only acted naturally when they didn't know they were being observed. Participants shared detailed information about individuals they'd been monitoring, including photographs taken without consent, records of daily routines, and even private communications that had been intercepted through various technical methods. The discussions were academic in tone, treating real people like research subjects in ongoing behavioral studies. But the lack of consent from the people being studied made these communities feel more like organized stalking than legitimate research. Emma asked me to spend more time in these surveillance-focused communities, documenting how they justified their activities and what psychological satisfaction participants seemed to derive from systematic invasion of privacy. The research assignment felt increasingly uncomfortable, but Emma's academic framework provided rationalization for continuing to study communities whose activities I found morally disturbing. She explained that understanding how people convinced themselves that surveillance was justified required extended observation of their psychological reasoning processes. Academic research often demanded temporary ethical discomfort for the sake of broader social understanding. Over several weeks of studying surveillance communities, I started noticing that some participants were sharing information about people in Norfolk, including details about individuals who lived and worked in areas I recognized from around Norwich. This wasn't abstract research into distant communities, but active documentation of potential victims who lived in my immediate geographic area. Some of the surveillance targets were described in ways that made me wonder if I might recognize them if I encountered them during normal daily activities. Local professionals, university students, even public service workers whose routines were being systematically documented by strangers. When I mentioned the local connection to Emma, she seemed genuinely excited about this development. Having surveillance activities that I could potentially verify through independent observation would enhance her research significantly. She suggested that I try to identify some of the Norwich area surveillance targets, comparing the community documentation with what I could observe about these individuals during my own daily routine. This would provide valuable academic insights into the accuracy of surveillance techniques and the psychological impact of systematic observation on both monitors and targets. The research methodology was shifting from studying online communities to potentially participating in their surveillance activities, but Emma's academic enthusiasm made the transition feel like natural progression rather than ethical boundary violation. I agreed to try identifying some surveillance targets, telling myself this was contributing to important social research rather than participating in organized stalking activities. But as I started paying attention to people around Norwich who matched descriptions from the surveillance communities, I realized that Emma's research had made me complicit in systematic invasion of privacy, affecting real individuals in my own community. The people being monitored weren't abstract research subjects, but neighbors, co-workers, and strangers whose private lives were being documented for the entertainment of online communities that treated human privacy as content to be consumed. I tried to investigate Emma's university research more thoroughly, looking for verification that her dissertation was legitimate academic work with appropriate ethical oversight. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. The sociology dissertation she described didn't exist in UEA's academic records, and the research methodology she was using wouldn't be approved by any legitimate university ethics committee. Emma wasn't conducting academic research into online communities, but was using academic terminology to recruit participants in activities that were actually designed to introduce people to surveillance and harassment communities for purposes that weren't related to scholarly investigation. I realized that the social experiment I'd been participating in was actually a recruitment process designed to gradually normalize systematic privacy violation by presenting it within academic frameworks that made harmful activities seem intellectually justifiable. My documentation of psychological responses to surveillance communities hadn't been contributing to sociology research, but had been providing information that could be used to refine recruitment techniques for drawing ordinary people into activities they would normally find morally unacceptable. Emma had been studying my psychological adaptation to increasingly extreme online communities, analyzing how academic justification could be used to overcome normal ethical resistance to systematic harassment and privacy violation. The research questionnaires I'd been completing had been documenting the effectiveness of different persuasion techniques for convincing people to participate in activities that violated their own stated moral principles. I'd become an unwitting test subject in research about psychological manipulation, rather than a volunteer contributor to legitimate academic sociology. When I tried to confront Emma about what I'd discovered, she'd already graduated and left Norwich, providing no forwarding address to family members who assumed she'd moved away for postgraduate study or employment opportunities. Her university contact information led nowhere, and her social media accounts had been deactivated, suggesting she'd planned to disappear once her recruitment activities in Norwich were completed. I never found out how many other research participants she'd recruited, or whether the surveillance activities I'd been introduced to were continuing with different facilitators who used similar academic justifications. The online communities continue operating. The systematic surveillance of Norfolk residents continues expanding, and people continue being monitored and documented by strangers who treat human privacy as entertainment content to be shared and analyzed. I still work as a children's librarian, still live in Norwich, still wonder whether some of the people I encounter might be involved in activities similar to what Emma was facilitating, using legitimate-sounding research frameworks to justify systematic violation of privacy and personal boundaries. But I'm also aware that academic-sounding requests for research assistance can be covers for recruitment into activities that have nothing to do with legitimate scholarship, and that people who want to help with what appears to be important social research can easily become complicit in systematic harassment disguised as intellectual investigation. The social experiment I participated in continues to affect how I think about online privacy and community behavior, but not in ways that Emma's supposed academic research would have intended if it had been legitimate scholarly work rather than systematic manipulation designed to recruit ordinary people into extraordinary violations of human decency. Sometimes I wonder how many other communities exist where people convince themselves that systematic harm is justified by intellectual frameworks that sound academic, but are actually rationalization for activities that most people would recognize as organized cruelty if they weren't presented within contexts that made them seem like legitimate research or social observation. The psychological techniques Emma used to gradually normalize my participation in surveillance communities were sophisticated enough to overcome my normal ethical instincts, suggesting that similar recruitment methods might be effective for drawing other well-meaning people into activities they would never choose to participate in if they understood what they were really agreeing to do. I never received the £200 Emma had promised for participating in her research, which seems like a small loss compared to discovering that I'd spent weeks documenting and analyzing systematic violation of privacy affecting real people in my own community. But the unpaid research debt feels symbolic of the broader deception involved in presenting recruitment for surveillance activities as academic work worthy of compensation and intellectual respect. The communities Emma introduced me to continue developing more sophisticated methods for monitoring and harassing their chosen targets, while recruitment techniques continue improving based on analysis of how ordinary people can be persuaded to participate in activities they would normally find morally unacceptable. There's something deeply unsettling about photographing places where people used to live. I didn't realize it at the time, but when you spend weeks documenting abandoned homes and personal belongings left behind, you start to feel like you're intruding on private grief, even when nobody's there to object. The initial contact came through my website, which gets maybe one inquiry a month if I'm lucky. Someone had seen my portfolio of architectural photography and wanted to commission similar work for what they described as a property documentation project. The message was professional enough, asking about my rates and availability for ongoing work over several weeks. I'd been freelancing for about 18 months by then, mostly doing wedding photography and the occasional corporate headshot session. The architectural work in my portfolio was really just a hobby. Photographs of interesting buildings around Nottingham that I'd taken to fill out my website and make it look like I had more diverse experience than I actually did. Business had been particularly slow that autumn. I'd managed to book a few weddings during the summer season, but those had dried up by October, and I was facing the prospect of either finding temporary work or moving back in with my parents in Derby. Neither option was particularly appealing for someone approaching 30 who'd spent the last few years trying to establish a creative career. So when this potential client offered to pay decent money for straightforward architectural photography, I was immediately interested. They explained that they needed detailed documentation of various properties for insurance and legal purposes. The sort of routine work that wouldn't be creatively fulfilling, but would pay the bills while I looked for more interesting projects. We arranged to meet at a cafe in the city centre to discuss the specifics. The man who met me was probably in his 40s, dressed casually but expensively, and seemed knowledgeable about photography and property documentation. He introduced himself as David and explained that he represented a company that specialized in property management and legal services. David showed me examples of the sort of photographs they needed, detailed interior and exterior shots that would document the current condition of various properties they were managing. Nothing particularly challenging from a technical standpoint, just thorough coverage that would be useful for insurance claims or legal disputes if necessary. The work would involve visiting properties across the East Midlands, usually during weekdays when they were empty. David emphasized that discretion was important, as many of the properties were privately owned, and the documentation needed to be conducted without drawing attention from neighbors or passers-by. He offered to pay about twice my usual day rate, explaining that the premium was due to the confidential nature of the work and the need for quick turnaround times. The company often needed documentation completed within days of acquiring management rights for new properties, which meant I'd need to be available at short notice and work efficiently. I agreed to take on the work, and David provided me with a detailed brief about their requirements. Each property needed to be photographed comprehensively, with particular attention to potential security vulnerabilities, access points, and sightlines from neighboring buildings. They also wanted documentation of any personal belongings left in the properties and evidence of recent occupation. The first assignment was a terraced house in a quiet residential street near the university. David gave me the address and a set of keys, explaining that the property was temporarily vacant while legal issues were being resolved. My job was to document everything thoroughly and submit the photographs within 24 hours. The house was exactly as David had described, empty but clearly recently occupied. There were still personal belongings scattered throughout the rooms, suggesting that whoever had been living there had left suddenly or under difficult circumstances. Nothing obviously valuable, just the sort of everyday items that people abandon when they have to move quickly. I spent several hours photographing every room from multiple angles, paying particular attention to the specific details David had requested. The work was straightforward but thorough, requiring careful attention to lighting and composition to ensure the images would be useful for their intended purposes. When I submitted the photographs, David seemed pleased with the quality and attention to detail. He immediately offered me another assignment, this time a flat above a shop in a different part of the city. The pattern was similar. Recently vacated property that needed comprehensive documentation for legal and insurance purposes. Over the following weeks, I photographed about a dozen properties across Nottingham and the surrounding areas. All were recently empty. All contained evidence of sudden departure, and all required the same detailed documentation of security features and personal belongings left behind. The work was steady and well paid, but I began noticing patterns that made me uncomfortable about what I was actually documenting. The properties all seemed to be occupied by people who had left under stressful circumstances. Unpaid bills, eviction notices, signs of financial difficulties that had forced sudden departures. More concerning was the specific nature of the photographs David had requested. The focus on security vulnerabilities and access points seemed excessive for routine property management. The detailed documentation of personal belongings felt intrusive, particularly when those belongings suggested the former occupants were struggling financially or dealing with personal difficulties. When I raised these observations with David, he explained that the company often dealt with properties that had been abandoned or vacated under difficult circumstances. The thorough documentation was necessary to protect both the property owners and his company from potential legal claims or insurance disputes. This seemed like a reasonable explanation for legitimate property management work. Abandoned properties do create legal and financial complications that require careful documentation. I convinced myself that my discomfort was probably just sensitivity to the obviously difficult circumstances that had led to these properties being vacated. But around the 6th week, David began requesting additional services that went beyond straightforward property photography. He wanted me to research the former occupants of the properties I'd photographed, gathering publicly available information about their current circumstances and new addresses. This felt like crossing a line from property documentation into surveillance of vulnerable people. When I expressed concerns about this expansion of my responsibilities, David reminded me that the information he was requesting was all publicly available and that understanding the circumstances of former tenants was standard practice in property management. He also mentioned that my photography work had been particularly valuable because of my attention to detail and discretion. The company was considering offering me additional work at higher rates, but they needed to be confident that I could handle more sensitive assignments that required absolute confidentiality. The promise of better paying work was tempting, especially as I was still struggling to find other sources of income. I agreed to provide basic research about the former occupants, telling myself that public record searches were legitimate and that understanding tenant circumstances was probably standard practice for property managers. The research revealed that many of the former occupants had been forced to leave their homes due to financial difficulties, family breakdowns, or legal problems. Most were now living in temporary accommodation or had moved in with relatives, suggesting they were experiencing ongoing housing instability. David seemed particularly interested in cases where former tenants had moved to new addresses within the local area. He began requesting follow-up visits to photograph these new locations, ostensibly to document whether former tenants had abandoned belongings that belonged to the properties they'd previously occupied. These follow-up assignments felt much more invasive than the original property documentation work. I was effectively conducting surveillance of vulnerable people who had been forced to leave their homes, photographing their new living situations under the pretense of recovering abandoned property. When I tried to refuse these follow-up assignments, David pointed out that I had already been conducting research into these people's circumstances for several weeks. From his perspective, photographing their new living situations was just a logical extension of work I was already doing. He also began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that he couldn't have gathered through our professional relationship. Comments about my financial situation, my living arrangements, and my career struggles that suggested he'd been researching my background just as thoroughly as I'd been researching the former tenants. This pattern of surveillance became more obvious over the following days. David would mention details about my daily activities that I hadn't shared with him, presented as casual observations, but clearly intended to demonstrate his knowledge of my personal routine. I realized that while I had been documenting vulnerable people's abandoned homes and current circumstances, David had been conducting similar surveillance of my own life. The photography assignments had been used to identify and track people who were experiencing housing instability, while also providing David with leverage over a photographer who was desperate enough for work to ignore ethical concerns. The break-in happened on a Tuesday evening, about 2 weeks after I'd tried to stop working with David. I came home to find my flat had been systematically searched, with particular attention paid to my computer and photography equipment. Nothing obviously valuable had been taken, but someone had clearly spent considerable time examining my work and personal files. The next morning, I received a message from David explaining that some of the photographs I'd taken contained sensitive information that required careful handling. He suggested that ending our working relationship abruptly could create security complications for his company, particularly if those photographs were shared with unauthorized parties. The message included several images taken inside my flat during the break-in, showing my computer screen, photography equipment, and personal documents. The implied threat was clear. They had access to my home and my work, and they were prepared to use that access to ensure my continued cooperation. I tried reporting the break-in to the police, but discovered that proving David's involvement would be difficult. The photography work had been presented as legitimate property management, the payments had been legal, and the surveillance could be explained as standard background checks on contractors handling sensitive assignments. The police took a report about the break-in, but without obvious evidence of theft or clear threats, there wasn't much they could do beyond suggesting I improve my home security and avoid further contact with clients who made me uncomfortable. David continued to contact me sporadically over the following months, offering new photography assignments and occasionally sending photographs taken near my home or workplace to remind me that his surveillance capabilities remained active. The pattern only stopped when I moved to a different city and changed my contact information. Even then, I received occasional messages for several weeks, suggesting that they were still attempting to re-establish our working relationship. I never determined what David's company was actually using the photographs and research for. The systematic documentation of vulnerable people's homes and circumstances could have been preparation for various forms of exploitation, burglary, identity theft, harassment, or other criminal activities targeting people who were already dealing with housing instability. What I do know is that they understood how to exploit the freelance economy to recruit unwitting accomplices for surveillance activities. They presented criminal intelligence gathering as legitimate property work, using financial pressure to ensure continued cooperation even when ethical concerns became obvious. The most disturbing aspect was how gradually I'd been drawn into increasingly invasive activities. Each assignment had seemed like a reasonable extension of the previous work, until I was conducting active surveillance of vulnerable people under the guise of routine property photography. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar companies, offering photography work for property documentation projects that require discretion and quick turnaround times. The pay rates are always generous, The initial meetings always seem professional, and the assignments always seem to involve recently vacated properties that need thorough documentation. I decline these offers immediately now, but I wonder how many other photographers have found themselves in similar situations, believing they're providing legitimate property services while actually participating in systematic surveillance of vulnerable people who have already lost their homes. I found a photograph of myself sleeping in my own bed, taken from inside my bedroom, tucked under my kitchen door this morning. The timestamp shows it was captured 3 hours ago. I probably shouldn't tell you what I've learned about my neighbor, or about the dark web marketplace that's been using my street as a hunting ground. But if something happens to me, if I disappear on a Tuesday evening like the others, maybe someone will understand why. It started when Mrs. Henderson next door went into hospital. Nothing dramatic, just a routine hip replacement that turned complicated. She'd lived in the terraced house beside mine for nearly 20 years, and suddenly there was this emptiness where her daily routines used to be. No more Radio 4 drifting through the thin walls at 7 sharp each morning. No more clatter of her walking frame on the path when she collected her milk. The estate agent's board went up about a fortnight after she'd moved into the care home permanently. One of those cheerful yellow signs promising quick sales and competitive fees. I didn't think much about who might move in next. You never really do you? You just assume it'll be someone ordinary, a young family perhaps, or another pensioner looking to downsize. The new owner arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. I only noticed because I was working from home that day, catching up on some freelance copywriting projects that had been piling up. Through my front window, I watched a battered white transit van pull up outside Mrs. Henderson's old place. No removal lorry, no boxes of furniture being carried in. Just one man with a heavy rucksack and what looked like a laptop bag. He was younger than I'd expected, probably somewhere in his 30s, with the sort of pale complexion that suggested he didn't spend much time outdoors. Dark hair that needed cutting, wearing a navy hoodie, and jeans that had seen better days. The kind of person you'd walk past in the street without a second glance. What struck me as odd wasn't his appearance, it was how he moved. He kept glancing around as he walked up the path, checking the neighboring houses, scanning the street like he was memorizing it. When he reached the front door, he spent several minutes just standing there before finally going inside. Not looking for keys or checking the address, just standing, watching. I told myself I was being nosy. New neighbors always seem a bit strange until you get used to them. But something about his behavior stuck with me, nagging away like a song you can't quite remember the words to. The next few weeks passed quietly enough. I'd occasionally catch glimpses of him through his windows late at night, always hunched over what appeared to be a computer screen. The blue glow was visible from my bedroom window if I happened to be up past midnight, which I was more and more often. My sleep had been disrupted since starting a new antidepressant, and I'd found myself padding around the house at strange hours, making cups of tea and staring out at the empty street. It was during one of these insomniac wanderings that I first saw him in his back garden. The terraced houses on our street all have small rectangular gardens separated by low brick walls. From my upstairs bathroom window, you can see into most of the neighboring yards. Mrs. Henderson had kept hers immaculate. Rose bushes, a small vegetable patch, one of those rotary washing lines that squeaked in the wind. Her replacement had different priorities. He was digging, not planting or weeding, but creating what looked like a series of rectangular plots about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Neat, methodical excavations that he worked on in complete darkness, using only the light from his phone to guide him. The earth he removed was being carefully bagged and presumably disposed of elsewhere, because there was never any pile of soil visible during daylight hours. I counted 6 of these plots before I stopped watching. Something about the precise measurements made my stomach turn. The sensible thing would have been to assume he was planning some sort of garden renovation. Maybe he was one of those people who prefer to work at night to avoid curious neighbors. Maybe he had a day job that made evening gardening impossible. Maybe he was just eccentric, but the plots were too uniform, too deliberate, and they never seemed to get filled with plants or paving stones or anything else you might expect. I started keeping a casual eye on his activities, the way you might monitor roadworks outside your house or construction noise that's disrupting your routine. Not obsessively, just noting the patterns when they interrupted my own schedule. He seemed to work exclusively at night, always alone, always methodical. During daylight hours, his house appeared completely empty, no movement behind the curtains, no car in the narrow driveway. About a month after he'd moved in, I noticed something else unusual. My internet connection had become frustratingly slow, particularly in the evenings. Pages that should load instantly were taking 30 seconds or more. Streaming services buffered constantly. At first, I blamed my provider. They're always making excuses about network maintenance and peak usage periods. But when I checked my router settings one evening, trying to identify the problem, I discovered something that made me pause. There were multiple devices connected to my home network. Devices I didn't recognize, with names like Garden Cam and Monitor Node and Backyard Watch. I changed my wireless password immediately, but the unknown connections returned within hours. Someone was accessing my internet, and they were using it to run what appeared to be surveillance equipment. The thought that followed was immediate and unwelcome. My new neighbor worked at night, appeared to have no visible job, and was apparently tech-savvy enough to hack wireless networks. He was also creating precise rectangular excavations in his back garden. I tried to push the implications away, but they kept resurging like a persistent headache. Instead of sleeping, I found myself researching missing persons cases in our local area, scrolling through police appeals and newspaper articles about people who had vanished without explanation. There were more than I'd expected. Young women, mostly, who had simply failed to return home from work or nights out. Cases that had gone cold after the initial investigations yielded nothing. The dates troubled me. Several of the disappearances had occurred in the months before Mrs. Henderson went into hospital, when the house next door had been empty and available. A convenient base of operations for someone who needed privacy and direct access to neighboring properties. I know what you're thinking, that I was letting paranoia get the better of me, creating connections where none existed. That's certainly what I told myself during the rational daylight hours when my theories seemed ridiculous and overblown. But the nighttime excavations continued, and my internet remained compromised despite multiple password changes and router resets. Worse still, I'd started noticing small signs that my own property was being observed. Scratches around my back door lock that I didn't remember. Footprints in the flower bed beneath my kitchen window that appeared overnight and were gone by morning. The feeling, growing stronger each day, that I was being watched from the house next door. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I'd been idly browsing social media one evening when I noticed a post from Sarah Collins, a woman I'd known vaguely at secondary school. She was sharing a missing person appeal for her younger sister Emma, who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier after leaving work at a restaurant in the city centre. Emma's photograph showed a slight girl with dark hair and pale skin, wearing a navy jacket. The description mentioned that she'd been carrying a laptop bag and was known to walk home alone late at night. The similarity to my neighbor was striking enough to give me pause, but what really caught my attention was a detail buried in the appeal text. Emma had been active on various online communities, particularly ones focused on privacy and internet security. Her sister mentioned that she'd been exploring the darker corners of the web, researching topics that had become increasingly concerning to her family. I stared at Emma's photograph for a long time, thinking about rectangular plots and surveillance equipment and the pale young man who worked exclusively in darkness. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I accessed the dark web. I won't go into the technical details of how that works. There are enough guides available if you're genuinely curious. What matters is that within an hour of browsing, I'd found what I was looking for. A marketplace buried several layers deep in the hidden internet, accessible only through specific channels and invitation systems. The site was called Garden Services, which should have been my first warning about what I was about to discover. It advertised itself as a community for people interested in discrete disposal solutions and property maintenance. The language was coded, euphemistic, but the underlying meaning was unmistakable once you understood the context. They were selling access to live streams. The feeds were categorized by location, with familiar postcodes and area names that made my hands shake as I scrolled through them. Most were listed as currently offline or archive access only, but there were half a dozen showing green status indicators suggesting active content. I clicked on one marked with my own postal district. The video quality was grainy, filmed from multiple angles that suggested carefully positioned cameras. The location appeared to be underground, probably a basement or converted cellar. The lighting was harsh and clinical, throwing sharp shadows across concrete walls. There were 6 separate enclosures visible in the main view. Rectangular spaces divided by metal barriers, each one approximately 6 feet by 3 feet. The same dimensions as the excavations in my neighbor's garden. 5 of the spaces appeared to be occupied. I slammed the laptop shut immediately, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might be sick. But the images had already burned themselves into my memory. The makeshift cells, the surveillance equipment, the careful documentation of what was happening in that underground space. I sat in my darkened living room for nearly an hour, trying to process what I'd seen and decide what to do about it. The rational part of my brain insisted I should contact the police immediately, report my suspicions and let trained professionals handle the investigation. But another part wondered what evidence I actually had. Unusual gardening habits and network intrusions weren't necessarily criminal activities. The dark web marketplace could be located anywhere in the world, operated by people with no connection to my neighbor or my street. Even if I reported everything I'd discovered, would anyone take it seriously enough to act? While I was debating internally, I heard the back gate creak open next door. Through my kitchen window, I could see the familiar hooded figure making his way across the garden in complete darkness. He was carrying what looked like a spade and several large plastic sacks, moving with the same methodical precision I'd observed over the previous weeks, heading directly toward the excavated plots. I watched him work for 20 minutes, filling in one of the rectangular spaces and immediately beginning work on a new one nearby. The displaced earth went into the plastic sacks, which he loaded into a wheelbarrow and presumably disposed of elsewhere. By the time he finished and returned indoors, there was no visible trace of his activities. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching Emma Collins' disappearance in greater detail. I found social media profiles that painted a picture of someone curious and technically minded, exactly the sort of person who might stumble across the wrong section of the dark web. Her final posts were about online privacy and digital security, subjects that could easily lead someone into dangerous territory if they weren't careful about their research methods. The timeline was troubling. Emma had vanished on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks earlier. My neighbor had been working in his garden on Tuesday nights ever since, always filling in existing plots and creating new ones. I tried to convince myself I was making unjustified connections, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore, particularly when I discovered that 2 other recent missing persons had also disappeared on Tuesday evenings, both young women with interests in technology and internet security. The kind of people who might be drawn to explore hidden marketplaces and underground communities. The kind of people who might accidentally attract the attention of someone offering discreet disposal services. That evening, I made my decision. I waited until nearly midnight when the familiar sounds of digging began next door, then made my way carefully through my back garden to the low brick wall that separated our properties. The height difference gave me a clear view of his activities, and what I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. He wasn't just creating burial plots. He was maintaining an underground facility that connected directly to his cellar through a series of concealed access points. The garden excavations were ventilation shafts and emergency exits for a much larger operation taking place beneath ground level. While I watched, he spent nearly an hour checking each of the rectangular spaces, using a torch to examine what appeared to be concealed drainage systems and air circulation equipment. This wasn't the improvised setup of someone acting on impulse. It was a carefully engineered facility designed for long-term operation. I had my phone ready to record evidence, but before I could begin filming, he looked up directly at me. We stared at each other for several seconds across the garden wall. His expression was calm, almost curious, as if my presence was expected rather than surprising. Then he smiled and gave a small wave, like a neighbor acknowledging another neighbor during a chance encounter. I ducked down immediately, my heart pounding, and made my way back to my house as quietly as possible. Once inside, I triple-locked the doors and closed all the curtains, trying to process what had just happened. He'd seen me watching him, seen me recording his activities, and instead of appearing concerned or defensive, he'd seemed pleased about it. The implications made my skin crawl, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his reaction had been planned, that he'd wanted me to discover what he was doing, wanted me to know exactly what was happening in the house next door. I spent the rest of the night sat in my front room with all the lights on, waiting for sounds from next door that never came. No digging, no footsteps, no indication that anyone was awake in the neighboring house. Just silence that felt more threatening than any noise could have been. The next morning, I found an envelope on my kitchen table, not pushed through the letterbox or left on the doorstep. On my kitchen table, inside my locked house, positioned exactly where I'd left my coffee mug the previous evening. The envelope contained a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed me standing at my bedroom window, taken from somewhere in the neighboring garden. I was clearly visible despite the darkness, captured in sharp detail that suggested professional surveillance equipment. The timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken several weeks earlier, long before I'd started paying attention to my neighbor's activities. The note was brief and written in neat, precise handwriting. It simply read, "Garden Services is always looking for new contributors. Your documentation skills would be valuable to our community. We'll be in touch soon." I'm writing this 3 months later, and I still haven't contacted the police. Not because I don't want to help Emma Collins and the others who've disappeared, but because I'm too frightened of what might happen if I do. The envelope proved that my neighbor could access my house whenever he chose, that he'd been watching me long before I'd started watching him, that my investigation into his activities had been noted and potentially encouraged from the very beginning. But there's something else that stops me from seeking help, something I discovered when I finally worked up the courage to check the Garden Services website again. There's a new section now, marked Upcoming Content, with a familiar address listed beneath it, my address. The preview shows a photograph of my own back garden, taken from multiple angles, with precise measurements for rectangular excavations that haven't been started yet. I haven't seen my neighbor for weeks now, but I know he's still there, still watching, still planning, still maintaining his underground facility while he waits for the right moment to expand operations. The house next door looks completely empty during the day, but I can see the blue glow of computer screens late at night. And sometimes, when the wind is in the right direction, I can hear sounds from beneath the ground that I try very hard not to think about. I keep telling myself I should pack up and leave, find somewhere far away where Garden Services can't reach me. But I know it wouldn't make any difference. They've already documented my movements, my routines, my vulnerabilities. They know exactly where to find me whenever they decide the time is right. So I stay here, keeping the curtains drawn and the doors locked, writing down everything I've discovered in case someone finds it useful later. In case anyone wonders what happened to me when I inevitably disappear on a Tuesday evening, just like Emma Collins and all the others. The excavations in my garden haven't started yet, but I know they will. The measurements are already planned, the drainage systems designed, the surveillance equipment tested and ready. I just have to wait for my turn to contribute to the community that's been watching me all along. My brother Tom had always been the successful one in our family, working in marketing for some tech company in London, earning enough to buy expensive gifts without thinking much about the cost. So when he offered to get me a proper laptop for my 30th birthday, I just assumed he was being generous in that casual way successful people are when they want to help family members who aren't doing quite as well. I was working part-time at a bookshop in Bath and trying to build a freelance editing business on the side, mostly helping university students polish their essays and dissertations for £20 an hour. The old computer I'd been using was painfully slow and kept crashing whenever I tried to work with larger documents, so a decent laptop would genuinely transform what I could accomplish. The machine he chose was considerably better than anything I could have afforded myself. A professional model that would handle any editing work I might get. But when I started setting it up, I noticed it came with software already installed that I didn't recognize. When I asked Tom about it, he just said they were productivity tools that would help me get better clients. My brother Tom had always been the successful one in our family. He worked in marketing for some tech company in London and earned enough to buy expensive gifts without thinking too much about the cost. The laptop he chose was considerably better than anything I could have afforded myself, a professional model that would handle any editing work I might get. When I thanked him for such a generous present, he mentioned that he'd set it up with some specialized software that would help me find higher-paying freelance opportunities. The programs were supposedly used by marketing professionals to identify potential clients who needed editing services but weren't advertising through conventional channels. He'd configured everything to save me the technical hassle of installation and setup, knowing that I preferred to focus on the actual writing and editing work. rather than dealing with software complications. The productivity tools he'd mentioned looked professional enough. Data analysis programs, client research applications, and networking software that seemed designed for business development rather than casual use. I assumed they were expensive marketing tools that he had access to through his company and was sharing to help me grow my editing business. Over the first few weeks of using the new laptop, I gradually explored the various programs Tom had installed, trying to understand how they might help me find better freelance opportunities. The client research software was particularly interesting, providing detailed information about individuals and businesses who might need editing services based on their online activities, communication patterns, and professional circumstances. The program could identify people who were working on writing projects, applying for grants or academic positions, or developing business proposals that would require professional editing assistance. Rather than competing with dozens of other freelancers for advertised editing jobs, I could potentially reach out to people who needed services but hadn't realized they should hire professional help. The software provided detailed profiles of potential clients, including information about their writing projects, deadlines, budgets, and personal circumstances that would influence their decision-making about hiring editorial assistants. The client intelligence was remarkably comprehensive, offering insights into people's professional needs and personal situations that would allow me to craft perfectly targeted pitches for editing services. Using the research tools Tom had provided, I started identifying potential clients around Bath and Bristol who seemed likely to need editing help based on their current projects and professional circumstances. The outreach campaigns I developed using this intelligence were considerably more successful than my previous approaches to finding freelance work. Instead of generic applications to advertise positions, I could offer specific solutions to problems that potential clients were actually experiencing. My editing business grew rapidly as I connected with academics, business owners, and graduate students who were genuinely grateful to be contacted by someone who understood their specific needs and could provide exactly the services they required. The income improvement was significant, allowing me to reduce my bookshop hours and focus more time on editing work that was both more interesting and considerably better paid than my previous freelance efforts. But as I became more successful using Tom's client research tools, I started noticing that the software provided access to information that seemed too detailed and personal to be gathered through normal business intelligence methods. The profiles included knowledge of people's private communications, personal relationships, financial circumstances, and even psychological assessments that wouldn't be available through public sources or conventional market research. Some potential clients were described in ways that suggested comprehensive surveillance of their daily activities, personal habits, and private concerns that went far beyond what would be necessary or ethical for business development purposes. When I questioned Tom about how the software obtained such detailed personal information, he explained that modern business intelligence used sophisticated data analysis techniques that aggregated information from multiple sources to create comprehensive client profiles. He assured me that all information was obtained through legitimate partnerships with data providers, and that the detailed intelligence was essential for effective business development in competitive markets. The technical explanation sounded plausible, and the client research was genuinely helping me build a successful editing business that was providing financial stability I'd never achieved through conventional freelance approaches. But I also started recognizing that some of the potential clients identified by the research software were people I knew personally. Neighbors, acquaintances from the bookshop, even friends who hadn't mentioned they were working on writing projects that might require editing assistance. The software's profiles of these familiar individuals were accurate in ways that suggested access to their private communications and personal circumstances, rather than analysis of publicly available information. I realized that the client research tools weren't just analyzing public data to identify business opportunities, but were systematically monitoring real people's private activities to gather intelligence that could be used for various purposes beyond legitimate business development. My successful editing business had been built using comprehensive surveillance data about Bath area residents who had no idea their personal information was being collected and analyzed for commercial exploitation. The detailed client profiles that had enabled my business growth were created through systematic invasion of privacy affecting people in my own community, many of whom I knew personally through work and social connections. I tried to investigate the software Tom had installed more thoroughly, attempting to understand what data sources were being used and how the personal information was being collected and distributed. The investigation led me to discover that the client research tools connected to parts of the internet that weren't accessible through normal browsing, where detailed personal information was being traded and analyzed for various commercial and non-commercial purposes. These hidden online spaces contained comprehensive surveillance data about individuals throughout the UK, compiled through systematic monitoring of their digital activities, personal communications, and daily routines. The information being traded included not just basic demographic and professional data, but detailed psychological profiles, personal vulnerabilities, financial circumstances, and social relationships that could be used for manipulation, exploitation, or harassment. My editing business had been built using intelligence gathered through systematic violation of privacy, affecting thousands of people who had no idea their personal information was being collected, analyzed, and distributed to facilitate various forms of commercial and personal exploitation. The client research that had seemed like innovative business intelligence was actually based on comprehensive surveillance data that was being used by various individuals and organizations for purposes that went far beyond legitimate business development. Some participants in these hidden communities used personal intelligence for systematic harassment and psychological manipulation of selected targets, while others focused on financial exploitation or identity theft, based on detailed knowledge of people's personal circumstances and vulnerabilities. The software Tom had provided wasn't just helping me find editing clients, but was giving me access to surveillance data that was being used throughout these communities for various forms of exploitation targeting real people who had never consented to having their private information collected and distributed. My successful freelance editing business had been built on the same comprehensive surveillance infrastructure that was being used by people who specialized in systematic harm to vulnerable individuals. When I confronted Tom about what I'd discovered, he admitted that the software came from contacts he'd made through his marketing work who had access to advanced business intelligence tools that weren't available through conventional commercial channels. He claimed he'd thought the tools were legitimate business applications and hadn't realized they were connected to broader surveillance and exploitation activities. But he also made it clear that my editing business had become dependent on intelligence gathered through these systems, and that attempting to operate without access to the detailed client research would make it impossible to maintain the income and success I'd achieved. He suggested that my concerns about privacy violations were outweighed by the genuine value I was providing to clients who needed editing services, and that my business success was helping people, even if the client acquisition methods raised ethical questions. The rationalization was appealing because my editing work was genuinely helpful and my clients were satisfied with the services I provided. But I also understood that my success had been built on systematic exploitation of personal information affecting hundreds of people in my own community. I never found a way to maintain my editing business without using intelligence gathered through surveillance systems that violated people's privacy. And gradually, my freelance income declined as I tried to find clients through conventional methods that didn't rely on personal data obtained without consent. The hidden communities continue operating. The systematic surveillance of UK residents continues expanding, and people continue having their personal information collected and distributed for various commercial and exploitive purposes without their knowledge or consent. The birthday gift that launched my successful freelance editing career turned out to provide access to comprehensive surveillance data that was being used throughout these communities for systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals, with my business success being built on the same privacy violations that facilitated harassment, manipulation, and financial exploitation of real people. I still do some editing work when I can find clients through legitimate channels, still work part-time at the bookshop, still wonder whether the people I encounter daily might be experiencing problems caused by exploitation based on personal intelligence that was gathered through the same surveillance systems that had enabled my brief business success. But I'm also aware that apparently legitimate business tools can provide access to systematic privacy violations that facilitate various forms of exploitation, and that professional success can be built on infrastructure that causes genuine harm to real people who have no idea their personal information is being collected and used against their interests. I found my own address listed on a dark web cleaning service, and the price they were charging made my blood run cold. It started because my flatmate James had been murdered 3 weeks earlier, and I was trying to understand how someone could just vanish from a shared house in Nottingham without anyone noticing, until the smell started seeping through the floorboards. The police had finished with the scene, but the landlord was refusing to pay for professional cleaning. He said it wasn't his responsibility, and we'd have to sort it ourselves if we wanted the deposit back. The other lads had already moved out, leaving me stuck with a lease and a bedroom that still had tape marks on the carpet where James's body had been found. I'd been researching cleaning companies online, looking for someone who specialized in what estate agents euphemistically called difficult situations, when I stumbled across something called biological remediation services. Most of the legitimate companies wanted hundreds of pounds up front, which I didn't have, so I kept digging deeper into more obscure websites. That's how I ended up browsing hidden services that didn't advertise through normal search engines. Sites that offered cleaning solutions for people who couldn't go through official channels. The kind of places that didn't ask questions about why you needed a bedroom carpet replaced or bloodstains removed from wooden floors. The site I found was called Complete Clearance Solutions and looked professional enough. Clean layout, detailed service descriptions, even customer testimonials that seemed genuine. They offered everything from basic carpet cleaning to full property restoration, with pricing that seemed almost too good to be true. What caught my attention was their specialization in what they called unattended death cleanup. They claimed to handle situations where police investigations had been completed, but standard cleaning services were insufficient. The before and after photos they showed were disturbing but impressive. Rooms that had been completely destroyed by violence or neglect, restored to pristine condition. I was scrolling through their service areas, looking for Nottingham postcodes, when I saw something that made me stop breathing for a moment. Listed under recently completed jobs was my exact address, with a completion date from just 2 days earlier. According to their records, someone had already paid for a full biological remediation service at my house. The job description mentioned extensive blood contamination and structural cleaning requirements, with a completion status showing the work had been finished on schedule. But nobody had been to the house. James's room was still exactly as the police had left it, complete with stained carpet and the lingering smell that made it impossible to sleep properly. If someone had paid for cleaning services, where were they? I tried calling the customer service number listed on the site, but it went to a voicemail system that asked for a job reference number before you could leave a message. When I tried submitting a query through their contact form, I got an automated response saying they'd get back to me within 24 hours. Instead of waiting, I decided to explore the site more thoroughly. That's when I discovered they offered more than just cleaning services. Hidden behind innocuous menu options were sections that made me realize this wasn't a legitimate business at all. They provided what they called evidence management, removing items from properties that might complicate insurance claims or police investigations. They offered witness relocation assistance for people who needed to disappear quickly and quietly. Most disturbing of all, they had a service called problem resolution that seemed to involve making entire situations vanish without a trace. The pricing structure was complex, based on factors like property size, contamination level, and something called discretion requirements. But when I found the specific listing for my address, the numbers didn't make sense for a simple cleaning job. Someone had paid nearly £3,000 for services at my house, but the work description included items that went far beyond carpet cleaning. Personal effects removal, documentation management, and occupant transition services were all listed as completed tasks. That's when I realized they weren't just cleaning James's room. They were planning to clean out everything else as well, including me. I started checking other addresses on their completed jobs list, cross-referencing them with local news reports and police databases. What I found was a pattern that made my hands shake as I typed. Most of the addresses corresponded to properties where violent crimes had occurred, but the timeline was wrong. The cleaning services were often scheduled and completed before the crimes had been discovered, sometimes even before they'd been committed. It was as if someone was booking cleanup services in advance, knowing that violent events were going to happen. Some addresses matched missing person cases that had never been solved. Others corresponded to houses that had been mysteriously abandoned by their occupants, leaving behind all their possessions but no forwarding addresses. A few matched properties that had been destroyed by unexplained fires or structural collapses. The more I researched, the clearer it became that this wasn't a cleaning service at all. It was something much more sinister, a business that specialized in making problems disappear permanently. And according to their records, I was scheduled to become one of those problems. I tried changing my routine, staying away from the house as much as possible, and sleeping on friends' sofas when I could manage it. But every time I came back to collect clothes or check the mail, something small had changed. A window left slightly open that I was sure I'd closed. Items moved just enough to be noticeable. Fresh footprints in the dust that had settled on James's bedroom floor. Someone was coming and going from the house, even though the locks hadn't been changed since James's death. They had keys, or they knew how to get inside without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. The worst part was that I couldn't report it to the police without explaining how I'd found the information in the first place. How do you tell investigating officers that you've been browsing illegal websites and found evidence that someone has paid for your own disappearance? They'd either think I was delusional or assume I was involved in James's murder somehow. I started documenting everything instead, taking photos of the house before I left and after I returned, noting every small change or sign of intrusion, keeping a record of the hidden website's listings and any updates to my supposed job status. building evidence that might be useful if I ever got the chance to present it. That's when I discovered the client messaging system. It was buried deep in the site's structure, accessible only through a series of redirect links that weren't visible from the main pages. But once I found it, I could see conversations between the service providers and their customers, discussing specific jobs and implementation details. The messages about my address made my stomach turn. The client, identified only by a user number, had been planning this for weeks before James was killed. They discussed optimal timing, cleanup requirements, and disposal methods with the clinical detachment of someone organizing a house renovation. But what really terrified me was reading about other jobs they'd commissioned. The client had been using this service regularly, arranging for people to disappear from properties across the Midlands. Always young men living in shared accommodation, always students or temporary workers who wouldn't be missed immediately. James hadn't been killed by a random intruder or a burglary gone wrong. He'd been specifically targeted by someone who collected people like trophies, then used professional services to erase all evidence of their crimes. And I was next on their list. I tried to warn the other potential victims whose addresses I found in the system, but most of the properties were empty when I visited them. Either the occupants had already vanished, or they'd never existed in the first place. The few people I managed to speak to thought I was either mentally ill or running some kind of elaborate scam. Nobody believes you when you tell them they're marked for death by a cleaning service that operates through hidden websites. It sounds insane even when you're living through it. The completion date for my job was getting closer. Less than a week, according to the site's updated timeline. I could see preparations being made through the client messages and discussions about access methods and disposal requirements that made it clear they weren't planning to wait much longer. I considered running, just packing everything I could carry and leaving Nottingham entirely. But the service seemed to have resources that extended far beyond a single city. Their completed jobs covered addresses from Manchester to Birmingham, suggesting they had operational capacity across multiple regions. More importantly, running would mean abandoning any chance of justice for James or the other victims. If I disappeared, the police investigation into his death would probably be closed as an unsolved case, and his killer would continue using these services to target new victims. Instead, I decided to document everything and make sure the evidence would survive even if I didn't. I copied all the website content I could access, including client messages, job listings, and payment records. I stored all of this information on multiple USB drives that were hidden in various locations around Nottingham. I wrote detailed explanations of what I'd discovered and left copies with friends who had instructions to take them to the police if I went missing. However, I did not expect anyone to actually follow through. People always assume missing persons have just chosen to disappear, especially young men with no close family connections. But at least the evidence would exist, waiting for someone who might eventually put the pieces together. The client messages showed increasing urgency as the completion date approached. They were growing impatient with delays and demanding confirmation that the job would proceed as scheduled. The service providers kept reassuring them that everything was under control, that the target hadn't shown any awareness of the threat. They were wrong about that last part, but I tried not to give any obvious signs that I knew what was coming. I maintained my normal routine as much as possible, continued going to lectures and meeting friends, acted like someone who was gradually recovering from the trauma of losing a flatmate to violent crime. But I also made preparations. I bought a cheap security camera and hid it in James's room, ensuring it was positioned to record anyone who entered through the window or door. Set up motion sensors around the house that would send alerts to my phone if someone came inside while I was away. I began carrying a personal alarm to ensure that someone was always aware of my whereabouts. Most importantly, I changed the job status on the cleaning service website. It took some experimentation, but I eventually figured out how to access their administrative system using credentials I found in cached pages. Not sophisticated hacking, just basic password recovery and some lucky guesses based on information that had been left publicly accessible. Once I was in their system, I could see the full details of my scheduled disappearance. The client had paid for what they called a premium erasure package, which included not just body disposal, but complete elimination of any evidence I'd ever existed. They planned to remove all my possessions, cancel my university enrollment, even delete my social media accounts to make it seem like I'd simply chosen to vanish. But I could also modify the job parameters. I changed the completion status to show that complications had arisen, that the target had become aware of surveillance and was taking countermeasures. Added notes suggesting that proceeding with the original plan would carry unacceptable risks of exposure. I marked the job as requiring executive review before taking any further action. It was a delaying tactic at best, but it bought me some time to figure out what to do next. The client was furious when they saw the updated status. Their messages became increasingly aggressive, demanding explanations and threatening to take their business elsewhere if the situation wasn't resolved immediately. But the service providers seemed genuinely concerned about the security implications of proceeding with a compromised operation. For the first time since I'd discovered my name on their completed jobs list, I felt like I might have some control over the situation. That feeling didn't last long. 3 days after I'd modified the job status, I came home to find my front door standing wide open and every room in the house completely empty. Not just my possessions, everything. Furniture, appliances, even the carpet from James's room where his body had been found. The house had been stripped bare, cleaned to an almost surgical level of sterility, and left like a blank canvas waiting for new occupants. There was no sign that anyone had ever lived there. No evidence that a violent crime had taken place just weeks earlier. They'd completed the cleaning job after all, just not in the way I'd expected. Standing in that empty house, I realized that modifying their website had been a mistake. Instead of deterring them, I'd just proven that I knew too much about their operations to be left alive. Now they had to be more careful about how they dealt with me, but they were still planning to finish what they'd started. The difference was that now it would look like I'd simply moved out voluntarily, rather than vanishing under mysterious circumstances. Anyone who came looking for me would find an empty house and assume I'd decided to leave Nottingham after the trauma of losing a flatmate. Perfect cover for a murder that no one would ever investigate. I'm writing this from a hotel in Derby, paid for with the last of my student loan money. I've been moving every few days, never staying in the same place twice, trying to stay ahead of whatever cleanup team they've assigned to handle the complications I've caused. But I know I can't keep running forever. They have resources and patience that I simply don't possess. Sooner or later, they'll find an opportunity to complete their contract, and I'll become just another name on their list of successfully resolved problems. The worst part is knowing that the evidence I collected probably won't help anyone. The website has changed its address several times since I first found it, and all the original content has been replaced with innocuous service listings that look completely legitimate. Even if someone finds the USB drives I hid around Nottingham, they'll just see copies of what appears to be a normal cleaning company's website. Nothing that would convince the police to investigate a missing person case with any real urgency. James is still dead, his killer is still active, and I'm still marked for elimination by a service that specializes in making problems disappear without trace. But at least I understand now why he died. Not because of anything he did or any threat he posed, just because someone with money and particular tastes had decided they wanted him gone. And there were people willing to provide that service for the right price. In a few days or weeks, I'll probably join him. Another young man who just vanished from a shared house, leaving no forwarding address and no obvious explanation for his disappearance. The only difference is that I know it's coming. My upstairs neighbor was live streaming everything that happened in my flat, and I only found out because someone in the chat recognized my address. I was browsing hidden sites looking for textbooks I couldn't afford. University prices for psychology texts were absolutely mental, and someone had told me about places where you could find PDF copies that weren't exactly legal, but weren't exactly unavailable either. Most students did it, especially those of us living on beans and toast, while trying to get through our degrees at Sheffield. The site I ended up on looked like a typical file-sharing platform, with sections for different types of content: academic materials, software, media files, the usual stuff you'd expect from people sharing things they probably shouldn't be sharing. But there was also a section called Live Content that I clicked on out of curiosity. It was streaming services mostly, football matches, TV shows, and sometimes webcam feeds from people's computers that had been compromised by malware. The quality was usually terrible, and most streams would cut out after a few minutes, but it was free entertainment when you had nothing else to do. That's how I stumbled across a stream titled Flat 2B, Sheffield Student House. The description was minimal, just the title and a viewer count showing about 30 people watching. When I clicked on it, I was looking at what appeared to be someone's living room. Basic furniture, textbooks scattered around, and a small kitchen visible in the background. Nothing particularly interesting, just a typical student flat. It took me a few minutes to realize I was looking at my own living room. The camera angle was from above, positioned somewhere near the ceiling, giving a clear view of most of the space. I could see my sofa, my desk, even the pile of washing I'd left by the door that morning. The stream was live. When I moved my laptop, I could see the movement reflected on screen with just a few seconds delay. Someone had been broadcasting my daily life to strangers on the internet, and I'd had no idea. The chat beside the video stream was active, with viewers commenting on everything they could see. People discussing my furniture and my clothes, even making jokes about my housekeeping. Some of the comments were sexual, speculating about my personal life in a way that made me uncomfortable. But what really disturbed me were the viewers who seemed to know details about my routine. Comments about what time I usually came home, which days I had lectures, even predictions about what I'd be eating for dinner based on previous observations. They'd been watching long enough to learn my habits. I closed the stream immediately and started searching my flat for hidden cameras. It didn't take long to find the first one. A tiny device no bigger than a coin, stuck to the ceiling light, fitting with what looked like industrial adhesive. The lens was barely visible, disguised as part of the fixture's design. There were 3 more cameras positioned around the flat. One in the bedroom, hidden inside a smoke detector that I'd never paid attention to. Another in the bathroom, concealed behind the mirror. The 4th was in the kitchen, built into what I'd assumed was a normal electrical socket. All of them were professional-grade equipment, not the sort of thing you'd buy in normal electronics shops. Someone had invested serious money in monitoring my living space, and they'd done it with enough skill that I'd never noticed anything unusual. The cameras were hardwired into the building's electrical system, which meant they'd been installed by someone with access to the property and knowledge of how the wiring worked. Not a random intruder, but someone who could work on the building legitimately without arousing suspicion. I live in a converted Victorian house split into 6 flats, with a communal entrance and thin walls that mean you can hear everything your neighbors do. The landlord employed a maintenance company for repairs and improvements, but there were also individual tenants who sometimes did their own work on their flats. My upstairs neighbor, Marcus, had moved in about 6 months earlier and immediately started what he called upgrading his flat, rewiring, installing new lighting, even running Ethernet cables through the walls for better internet connectivity. He'd been very friendly about it, warning all the neighbors about potential disruptions and even offering to do similar work for anyone else who was interested. I thought he was just being helpful, a postgraduate student in computer science who knew about technology and wanted to improve his living situation. He'd even helped me fix my internet connection when it was running slowly, explaining that the building's wiring was old and sometimes caused interference. Now I realized he'd probably been installing surveillance equipment while pretending to help with routine maintenance. I tried accessing the stream again from my phone, this time watching from the corridor outside my flat. The feed was still active, showing my empty living room with the same professional quality and multiple camera angles. In the chat, people were asking where I'd gone and when I'd be back. Someone posted what they claimed was my university timetable, listing the days and times when my flat would definitely be empty. Another user shared photographs that appeared to have been taken through my windows from the building's back garden. The level of information they had about my life was comprehensive and terrifying, but most disturbing was a user who seemed to be running the stream. They were answering questions about the technical setup, explaining how the cameras had been installed and boasting about the quality of the footage. When someone asked about audio, they mentioned that microphones had been built into each camera, providing full sound coverage of everything that happened in the flat. They'd been listening to my phone calls, my conversations with friends, even my private moments when I thought I was completely alone. Months of my life had been broadcast live to strangers who treated my privacy as entertainment. I needed to confront Marcus, but I also needed evidence that would be useful if I decided to involve the police. The stream itself might disappear at any moment if he realized I'd discovered it, so I started recording everything I could see on my phone. The chat logs were particularly valuable, showing usernames and timestamps that might be traceable. Some viewers had been careless enough to mention personal details about themselves, geographic locations, even usernames from other social media platforms that could potentially identify them. But I also needed to be careful about how I gathered evidence. If Marcus realized I knew about the cameras, he might destroy everything and claim ignorance. Worse, he might have other capabilities I wasn't aware of, access to my computer, my phone, even my bank accounts if he'd been monitoring my passwords and personal information. I decided to act normally while I figured out what to do next. Went back into my flat, carried on with my evening routine, tried not to look directly at any of the camera positions. But knowing I was being watched made every movement feel artificial and uncomfortable. The worst part was thinking about all the private moments that had been broadcast without my knowledge. Times when I'd been upset or sick, or just trying to relax in what I'd thought was the safety of my own home. All of it had been entertainment for strangers who saw me as nothing more than a character in their personal reality show. I started paying closer attention to sounds from the flat above mine. Marcus's computer was often running late into the night, and I could hear him moving around at odd hours. Sometimes there were other voices, people visiting who stayed for just short periods. Now I wondered if they were coming to watch the live feeds in person, treating my surveillance as a social activity. The next evening, I heard him talking to someone about expanding the setup. His voice carried clearly through the thin ceiling, and he was discussing installing additional cameras in the building's common areas, the hallway, the shared garden, even the communal laundry room, where several female tenants did their washing. He wasn't just targeting me. He was planning to monitor everyone in the building. I tried researching the legal options for dealing with hidden surveillance, but the laws around privacy and recording were more complicated than I'd expected. Proving that cameras had been installed without consent required evidence that might be difficult to gather safely. And if Marcus had been careful about how he'd access my flat, it might be hard to prove he was responsible. Meanwhile, the stream continued broadcasting my daily life to a growing audience. The viewer count had increased to over 50 people, and the chat was becoming more active and invasive. People were making requests for specific activities, trying to influence my behavior by posting suggestions about what they wanted to see. Some comments suggested that viewers were sharing the stream link with others, spreading it across different platforms and communities. My privacy was being violated on an increasingly large scale, with no way to know how many people had seen intimate moments from my life. The worst part was the sense of complete helplessness. Even knowing about the cameras, I couldn't safely remove them without alerting Marcus that I'd discovered his operation, and I couldn't prove he was responsible without potentially destroying evidence that might be needed for any legal action. I started sleeping at friends' houses when possible, claiming I was having problems with noise from upstairs, but I couldn't avoid my own flat entirely without arousing suspicion, and I needed to maintain the appearance of normal routine while I decided how to handle the situation. During the day, when Marcus was usually out, I could hear electronic sounds from his flat that suggested he was monitoring multiple feeds simultaneously. Not just mine, but possibly other properties as well. The scope of his surveillance operation was larger than I'd initially realized. I tried finding other streams on the same platform that might be connected to his setup. It didn't take long to discover feeds from 2 other addresses in Sheffield, both showing student accommodation similar to mine. Young people living alone, unaware they were being watched by audiences who discussed their lives like they were characters in a television program. The comment histories on these other streams showed the same usernames that appeared on mine, suggesting a dedicated community of people who specialized in voyeuristic surveillance of students. They shared information about different streams, compared the quality of various setups, even rated their preferred targets based on physical appearance and daily routines. It was a systematic violation of privacy affecting multiple victims, operated as entertainment for people who saw nothing wrong with invading the most intimate aspects of strangers' lives. I finally decided to contact the police, but I needed to be strategic about how I presented the information. Simply claiming that someone was streaming my flat wouldn't be enough. I needed evidence that clearly showed the scope of the operation and identified Marcus as the person responsible. I spent a week documenting everything I could safely gather. Screenshots of the streams, recordings of the chat conversations, photographs of the hidden cameras taken from angles that wouldn't be visible to someone monitoring the feeds. Even audio recordings of Marcus discussing his technical setup with visitors to his flat. When I finally made the report, the officer seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of the surveillance operation. They explained that this type of voyeuristic streaming was becoming more common, especially targeting students who lived alone and might not notice subtle signs of intrusion. But they also warned me that building a case would take time, and that Marcus would probably become aware of the investigation before any arrest could be made. In the meantime, I'd need to continue living normally to avoid alerting him that his operation had been discovered. The investigation is still ongoing, several weeks later. Marcus continues to live upstairs, apparently unaware that his activities are being monitored by law enforcement. The streams are still active, still broadcasting my daily life to audiences who remain completely unaware that they're now part of a criminal investigation. I've had to accept that months of my private life will never be private again. Somewhere out there, people have recordings of intimate moments that were never meant to be shared. My sense of security in my own home has been permanently destroyed, and I'll probably never feel completely safe in any private space again. But what disturbs me most is knowing that this is probably happening to other students in other cities, and most of them will never discover they're being watched. They'll live their entire university experience unaware that strangers are monitoring their most vulnerable moments for entertainment. The technology for this kind of surveillance is becoming cheaper and easier to install, while the legal protections for victims remain inadequate. People like Marcus can violate dozens of lives before anyone even realizes what's happening, and by then the damage is irreversible. I still live in the same flat, still go through my daily routine under the observation of hidden cameras, but now I know I'm being watched, and that knowledge has changed everything about how I experience what should be the most private aspects of my life. The strangest part is that I was invited, not by someone I knew, obviously. The message just appeared in my university email one morning, buried between assignment reminders and spam about student loans. The subject line was blank, and the sender was just a string of random letters and numbers that looked like someone had mashed their keyboard. I almost deleted it without opening it. Would have, probably, if I hadn't been procrastinating on my dissertation about media psychology. Instead, I clicked it while eating cereal and half watching morning television. The email contained a single line of text and what looked like a web address, though not one I recognized. The text was simple enough. You've been selected for exclusive access. Interest in human behavior noted. That last bit made me pause. My dissertation was about online behavior and digital voyeurism, something I'd been researching for months. I'd written papers on it, posted about it in academic forums, even given a presentation to my media studies class. Someone had clearly been paying attention to my work. I'm not stupid. I knew this was probably some sort of scam or phishing attempt, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore, and curiosity has always been my weakness. I copied the address and decided to investigate. The link didn't work in my normal browser. After some trial and error, I realized I needed different software to access it. It took me most of the afternoon to figure out the technical side, but eventually I found myself staring at a basic web page with a dark background and minimal text. "Welcome," it said. "Your academic interest in observational behavior has been noted. Please confirm your identity to proceed." Below that was a form asking for basic details. Nothing too personal, just my name, age, and location. I hesitated for a long moment before filling it out. After all, if this was related to my research, it might actually be useful for my dissertation. The next page was more interesting. It explained that I was being granted access to what it called live behavioral studies, real-time observations of human subjects in various scenarios. The text was clinical and academic in tone, describing these as opportunities to witness genuine human reactions under stress. It sounded like exactly the sort of thing that would be invaluable for my research, assuming it was legitimate. The page also mentioned that access was limited and that sessions were scheduled at specific times. A timetable showed several slots over the coming week, each lasting about an hour. I bookmarked the page and spent the next day thinking about it. On one hand, it could be a genuine research opportunity. On the other, it could be anything from a student prank to something more sinister. But my dissertation deadline was approaching, and I needed fresh material. The first session was scheduled for that Thursday evening. I logged in about 10 minutes early, not sure what to expect. The page had changed to show a simple black screen with a timer counting down from 5 minutes. Below that was a text box where I could apparently type messages, though I wasn't sure who would see them. When the timer reached 0, the black screen was replaced by what looked like a live video feed. The image quality wasn't great, and the lighting was dim, but I could make out what appeared to be a small room with concrete walls. A single chair sat in the center, currently empty. Other viewers had apparently joined the session. Messages began appearing in the text box, short comments and observations that suggested people were treating this as some sort of academic exercise. Someone mentioned psychological stress responses. Another person referenced behavioral studies they'd read about. Then someone entered the room on screen. They were wearing ordinary clothes and moved hesitantly, looking around as if unsure where they were supposed to be. When they sat in the chair, I could see they appeared uncomfortable, shifting frequently and glancing toward what I assumed was a camera. The messages from other viewers became more analytical. Comments about body language, stress indicators, fight or flight responses. It felt like watching a psychology experiment, though I couldn't understand what the actual study was supposed to measure. After about 20 minutes, another person entered the frame. This individual moved with more purpose, carrying what looked like a clipboard or notepad. They began asking questions that I couldn't hear, but the seated person's reactions were visible enough. Increasing agitation, attempts to get up from the chair, obvious distress. The academic tone of the viewer comments started to shift. People were noting the ethical implications of the study, questioning the consent processes, wondering about the institutional review board approval. I found myself typing similar concerns. But then something changed in the room. The person with the clipboard set it aside and picked up something else. Even through the poor video quality, I could see the seated individual's reaction was immediate and intense. Pure terror. The viewer messages became more urgent. People were demanding to know what institution was running this study, what the protocols were, whether there were safety measures in place. But no one seemed to be responding to our concerns. I watched for another 10 minutes before I couldn't take it anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't a legitimate academic study. I closed the browser and tried to convince myself that what I'd seen had been some sort of performance art or elaborate role-play scenario. But I couldn't stop thinking about the fear in that person's eyes. I didn't log in again for several days. Instead, I tried to focus on my dissertation, using more conventional research sources and avoiding the strange website entirely. But the images from that session kept creeping back into my thoughts, and I found myself wondering what had happened after I'd logged off. The next scheduled session was the following Tuesday. Despite my better judgment, I found myself logging in again, telling myself I needed to understand what I'd witnessed before I could put it behind me. This time, the room was different, larger, with better lighting, and what looked like medical equipment visible in the background. The setup felt more professional, more organized. The viewer count was higher too. Apparently word was spreading about these sessions. The subject who entered this room was clearly distressed from the moment they appeared on screen. They were looking around frantically, trying door handles that didn't seem to open, calling out to someone I couldn't see. The academic comments from viewers had disappeared entirely, replaced by expressions of shock and demands for explanation. That's when I realized what I was actually watching. These weren't psychology experiments or behavioral studies. These were something else entirely. Something that had been disguised as academic research to attract viewers like me. People whose legitimate interest in human behavior could be exploited. I should have left immediately. Should have closed my laptop and reported what I'd seen to the police. But instead, I found myself transfixed by the horror of it all. The realization that I'd been deliberately targeted, specifically chosen because of my academic interests, made it feel personal in a way that was hard to ignore. The person running these sessions had studied my work, identified me as someone who might be interested in observing human behavior, and then systematically drawn me in with appeals to my academic curiosity. I'd been manipulated, and the manipulation had worked perfectly. Over the following weeks, I continued logging into the sessions, not because I wanted to see what happened. The content was disturbing enough that I often found myself looking away from the screen, but because I needed to understand the scope of what I'd stumbled into. Each session featured a different room, a different setup, different individuals, but the pattern was always the same. Someone would be brought into the space, clearly against their will, and then subjected to experiences that became progressively more disturbing. The viewer base seemed to be growing steadily. Comments suggested that people were sharing access with others, spreading the links through various channels. But what struck me most was how many viewers seemed to have been recruited the same way I had, through appeals to academic or professional interests. There were psychology students like myself, but also medical students, sociology researchers, and people working in law enforcement or social services. All of us had been identified as individuals whose legitimate professional interests could be used to justify initial access. It was a brilliant recruitment strategy, really. Rather than trying to find people who were actively seeking out disturbing content, they targeted those of us who might have valid reasons for wanting to observe human behavior under stress. Our professional credentials gave us cover, even to ourselves. I started keeping notes about the sessions, documenting what I observed and trying to identify patterns. I told myself this was evidence gathering, that I was building a case to present to the authorities. But really, I think I was just trying to make sense of my own complicity. Because that's what it was, ultimately, complicity. Every time I logged in, every minute I spent watching, I was participating in something terrible. The fact that I'd been manipulated into it didn't change the reality of my involvement. The sessions began to feel routine after a while. I'd recognize certain rooms that appeared repeatedly, suggesting these weren't one-off events, but part of some ongoing operation. The timing seemed coordinated too. Sessions in different rooms would start at staggered intervals, allowing viewers to move between them. But what disturbed me most was how normal it all started to feel. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a kind of numb fascination. I'd find myself critiquing the camera angles or noting technical details rather than focusing on what was actually happening to the people on screen. That normalization was perhaps the most frightening aspect of the whole experience. How quickly something horrific could become just another part of my routine. How easily I could compartmentalize it, separating my normal life from these evening sessions where I'd watch unspeakable things unfold. About 6 weeks after that first session, something changed. I logged in as usual, but instead of the familiar room selection screen, I was greeted by a different message. "Thank you for your participation in our observational study," it read. "Your engagement has been noted and appreciated. You have been selected for advanced access privileges. Below that was a new set of options I hadn't seen before. Different types of sessions, different levels of access, different ways to participate. The language was still clinical and academic, but the implications were clear enough. I was being offered the chance to move from passive observer to active participant. The message explained that my consistent attendance and demonstrated interest qualified me for what they called collaborative sessions, events where viewers could provide input and direction rather than simply observing. The language made it sound like a natural progression, the next step in an ongoing research project. But I knew better by then. This wasn't about research or academic study. This was about gradually drawing people deeper into something terrible, using their initial curiosity as a hook to secure their continued involvement. The truly disturbing part was how tempting the offer was. After weeks of watching passively, the idea of having some control over what happened was oddly appealing. Not because I wanted to cause harm, but because the powerlessness of being just an observer had become its own form of torture. I stared at that message for nearly an hour before closing the browser without responding. But I kept thinking about it over the following days. The progression they were offering felt inevitable, like a path I'd been on since that first invitation email. That's when I finally understood the full scope of what I'd encountered. This wasn't just about providing content for people who were already predisposed to watch it. It was about creating those people, gradually converting ordinary individuals into active participants through careful manipulation and escalation. They'd identified me as someone with legitimate academic interests, drawn me in with appeals to those interests, normalized my participation through repeated exposure, and then offered me a path to deeper involvement. Each step had felt logical and justifiable at the time. How many others had received similar invitations? How many had progressed further down this path than I had? And how many people who ended up in those rooms had started as viewers, gradually drawn into participation through the same process I'd experienced? I deleted all the bookmarks and access software from my computer that night, tried to put the whole experience behind me and focus on finishing my dissertation through conventional research methods. But the questions wouldn't leave me alone. 3 months later, I received another email. Different sender, different format, but the same basic message. I'd been selected for access to exclusive content based on my demonstrated interest in human behavior. This time, they were offering access to what they called historical archives, recordings of previous sessions that I could review at my own pace. I deleted the email immediately, but the fact that it had found me again, despite my efforts to distance myself from the whole thing, was deeply unsettling. Somehow, my participation in those sessions had marked me permanently. I was now part of their recruitment database, someone to be contacted periodically with new opportunities for involvement. That was nearly a year ago now. I've received 4 more emails since then, each offering different types of access, different levels of participation. The language has evolved slightly each time, becoming more sophisticated in its appeals to my academic interests. I've deleted them all without opening the links, but I'll admit that the temptation is still there. The curiosity that got me involved in the first place hasn't disappeared, and part of me wonders what I might have missed by stepping away. That's the most frightening realization of all. Not that such things exist, or that people participate in them, but how easily I could have become one of those participants. How the right combination of manipulation and escalation could turn someone like me, someone who considers themselves ethical and rational, into an active collaborator in something terrible. The dissertation I eventually submitted focused on digital manipulation and the psychology of online recruitment. I got a first-class mark and several offers for postgraduate study, but I declined them all. The idea of pursuing further research into human behavior no longer appeals to me the way it once did, because I know now how that interest can be used against you, how academic curiosity can become a vulnerability, exploited by people who understand exactly how to identify and target individuals like me. The emails still come occasionally, usually around the time of academic deadlines or conference seasons, when students and researchers might be most desperate for new material. The timing is never coincidental. I wonder sometimes about the other people who were in those viewer sessions with me, whether they received similar follow-up invitations, whether any of them accepted the offers for increased participation, whether some of the people I saw in later sessions had started as viewers themselves. The thought keeps me awake some nights. The possibility that I witnessed people who had started exactly where I did, drawn in by the same appeals to academic interest, gradually manipulated into deeper involvement until they found themselves on the other side of the camera. I tell myself I made the right choice by walking away, but part of me will always wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd accepted those offers for advanced access, whether I would have had the strength to resist the gradual escalation, or whether I would have become something I never thought I could be. That uncertainty is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the whole experience. The knowledge that the line between observer and participant, between victim and perpetrator, might be thinner than any of us would like to believe. The latest email arrived just yesterday. Same pattern, different wording. They're still out there, still recruiting, still finding new ways to identify and exploit people's legitimate interests for terrible purposes. I deleted it like all the others, but for just a moment, I hesitated before clicking delete, and that hesitation terrifies me more than anything I saw in those sessions.